In the darkness of the night, there was a thin and lonesome young boy in a secluded place by the name of Clay Vase Alley. At this moment, he was following the traditions of the area, holding a candle in one hand and a peach branch in the other. The young boy was using the candle to illuminate the ceiling, the walls, and the wooden bed in the room, and simultaneously, he was tapping the peach branch around to try and drive away creatures like snakes, scorpions, and centipedes. At the same time, he was chanting an old mantra that had been passed down in this small town for generation upon generation. On the second day of the second month, the candle illuminates the ceiling while the peach branch taps the walls, leaving no place for snakes and insects to hide. The young boy's name was Chen Ping'an, and both his parents had passed away at a very early stage in his life. The town that he lived in was extremely renowned for producing chinaware. Ever since the founding of the nation, the town had taken on the important task of producing chinaware to be offered to the imperial court, and there were imperial officials constantly stationed in the town, overseeing the operation of the official kills. Without anyone to rely on, Chen Ping'an became a potter at a very young age. In the beginning, he was only able to perform some menial tasks and manual labor, toiling away arduously for several years under a reluctant master with a terrible temper. In a cruel twist of fate, just when he had begun to grasp some of the basics of pottery firing, the town suddenly lost the right to host official kills. Over the course of just a single night, all of the dozens of coiling dragon-like kills throughout the town were ordered to be shut down by the authorities. Chen Ping'an set down the newly snapped peach branch before blowing out the candle. He then made his way out of the room and sat down on the steps before looking up at the starry night sky. He could still clearly recall that his old master was a man with the surname of Yao, and he had only been willing to accept him as half a disciple. One late autumn morning the previous year, he was discovered to have passed away peacefully while seated on a small bamboo chair, facing the kiln with his eyes closed. However, ultimately, people who were as devoted and unyielding as old man Yao were part of the minority. For generations, the potters in the small town had only engaged in this one line of work, and they didn't dare to overstep their boundaries and continue to produce imperial ware, nor did they dare to sell their stocks of imperial ware to the common folk. Thus, they could only turn to other avenues to make ends meet. At just 14 years of age, Chen Ping'an was also kicked out, and after returning to Clay Vase Alley, he continued to reside in this old and dilapidated house under bleak and impoverished conditions. Even if he wanted to be a spendthrift rich kid, there was simply no wealth for him to squander. After drifting around aimlessly for a while, he was unable to find any sources of income. He was only just barely able to feed himself with his meager savings, and a few days ago, he heard that a foreign blacksmith with the surname of Ruan had arrived in Dragon Riding Alley, an alley that was a few streets away. The old blacksmith had declared that he was planning to take 7 or 8 disciples, and no wages would be provided, but meals were ensured. Chen Ping'an had immediately gone to try his luck, but to his dismay, the old blacksmith only took a side glance at him before turning him away. At the time, Chen Ping'an had felt quite perplexed. Could it be that blacksmithing didn't rely on the strength of one's arm, but the charm of one's looks instead? Chen Ping'an had a rather frail appearance, but his strength was not to be underestimated. He had developed great physical conditioning from many years of pottery molding and firing, and in addition to that, he had traveled extensively with old man Yao, exploring all types of places while carrying out the most tiresome and degrading tasks without any complaints. Unfortunately, despite his efforts, old man Yao never took a liking to him. He was always disdainful toward Chen Ping'an for his lack of talent, an area in which he was severely outmatched by old man Yao's most prized disciple, Lu Xianying. One couldn't blame the old man for playing favorites. Ultimately, the master was only responsible for teaching the basics, while the disciples' talent and hard work decided how far they would go. As an example of their disparity in talent, Lu Xianying was able to achieve the same level of mastery in the monotonous task of pottery molding in half a year that Chen Ping'an reached after toiling away for 3 years. Even though there was a chance that Chen Ping'an would never use the skill again, he still performed his usual routine, closing his eyes and envisioning a bluestone slab and a pottery wheel in front of himself. He then began to simulate pottery molding practice, continuing to hone his skills. Once every 15 minutes, he would take a short break to shake out his wrists. Only after repeating this process until he was completely exhausted did he rise to his feet, strolling through the yard while performing some stretches. No one had taught him to do any of this. It was just a routine that he had made up himself. All of a sudden, the peace and quiet was punctuated by the harsh sound of a mocking jeer. Qin Ping'an stopped in his tracks, and just as he expected, there was a boy roughly the same age as him squatting on the top of the wall, looking down at him with a derisive sneer and making no effort to hide his disdain. The boy was an old neighbor of Qin Ping'an's, and it was said that he was an illegitimate son of the former kiln supervision official. That official had returned to the capital for a debriefing for fear of being impeached by imperial censors, and he had left his illegitimate son to be looked after by his successor, who was a rather close friend of his. Now that the town had inexplicably lost the right to produce imperial ware, the kiln supervision official responsible for overseeing the operation of the official kilns was left without a job. And he had no interest in continuing to look after the illegitimate son of an imperial court colleague. After leaving some money behind, he hurriedly traveled to the capital to salvage his relations with powerful figures there. Unbeknownst to the young boy, he had been completely abandoned, and he continued to live a carefree and leisurely life, constantly wandering the town with his personal maidservant, never having to worry about money, even though he didn't do a day of work throughout the year. The earthen walls separating the homes in Clay Vase Alley were all very short, so the young boy could have easily looked over the wall to the other side, but he always liked to squat on top of the wall whenever he spoke to Qin Ping'an. The neighboring boy's name was Song Jisun, a name that was far more sophisticated compared with Qin Ping'an's shallow and tacky name. Even his personal maidservant, Ji Gue, had a very elegant name. At this moment, Ji Gue was standing on the other side of the wall with a timid look in her large, round eyes. All of a sudden, a voice rang out from the entrance of the courtyard. "Are you willing to sell that maidservant?" Song Jisun was rather startled by the question, and he turned to discover a completely unfamiliar brocade-robed young boy standing outside the courtyard with a faint smile on his face. Beside the brocade-robed young boy stood a tall and broad, elderly man with a fair complexion and a benevolent look on his face. The old man's eyes were slightly narrowed as his gaze roamed over the young trio in the two neighboring courtyards. His gaze swept over Qin Ping'an without any pause, but his attention lingered on Song Jisun and his maidservant, and the smile on his face gradually grew more pronounced. Song Jisun took a glance at the brocade-robed young boy out of the corner of his eye as he replied, "Sure, why not?" "How much do you want for her?" the brocade-robed young boy asked with a faint smile. Jigue's eyes widened with incredulity upon hearing this exchange, making her resemble a panicked deerling. Song Jisun rolled his eyes as he raised a finger and wagged it from side to side. "I want 10,000 taels of silver." The brocade-robed young boy's expression remained unchanged as he nodded in response. "All right, I'll take her." The boy didn't appear to be joking, and Song Jisun hurriedly amended, "Actually, I want 20,000 taels of gold." An amused smile appeared on the boy's face as he said, "I was just fooling around." Song Jisun was far from amused. The young boy paid no further heed to Song Jisun as he turned his gaze to Qin Ping'an. "It's all thanks to you that I was able to buy that carp today. After taking it back home, the more I looked at it, the more I fell in love with it, so I decided that I had to come and thank you in person. That's why I asked Grandpa Wu to bring me here to see you right away." He tossed a heavy embroidered pouch to Qin Ping'an, then said with a vibrant smile, "This is my thanks to you. We're all clear now." Qin Ping'an was just about to say something, but the brocade-robed young boy had already departed, leaving Qin Ping'an to look on with furrowed brows. Earlier in the day, he just so happened to spot a middle-aged man walking down the street while carrying a fish basket. The man had caught a golden carp that was around the same length as a human hand, and it was flailing around vigorously in the bamboo basket. Qin Ping'an felt like the golden carp had a very festive and jubilant appearance, and he asked the man if he was willing to sell the fish for 10 copper coins. The man had originally only intended to eat the fish, but he immediately jumped on the opportunity to make a profit from his catch, asking for an exorbitant price of 30 copper coins. The impoverished Qin Ping'an naturally didn't have that much spare money on his hands, but at the same time, he couldn't bear to leave the golden carp behind. Hence, he began to barter with the man, and he was willing to take the fish for 15 copper coins, even 20. Right as the man was beginning to show signs of relenting, the brocade-robed young boy and the old man just so happened to pass by, and they bought the carp and the fish basket for 50 copper coins without any hesitation, leaving Qin Ping'an to look on with a wistful expression. After glaring at the departing figures of the young boy and the old man for a while, Song Jisun withdrew his gaze with a resentful expression before jumping down from the wall. A thought then suddenly seemed to have occurred to him, and he turned to Qin Ping'an as he asked, "Do you still remember that foreleg from last month?" Qin Ping'an nodded in response. Not only did he remember it, it was a very clear memory in his mind. According to the customs and traditions that had been passed down for several centuries in the small town, it was a good omen for Ophidian creatures to make their way into one's home. And it was considered to be extremely taboo for the owners of such fortunate homes to chase out or kill said creatures. On the first day of the first month on the lunar calendar, Song Jisun had been sunbathing while sitting on his doorstep when a creature colloquially known as a four-legged snake began to scurry into the house right under his nose. Song Jisun grabbed the creature before throwing it out of the yard, but to his surprise, even though the creature was battered and disoriented from the fall, it seemed to only grow more and more emboldened and determined with each failure, attempting to crawl into the house over and over again. Song Jisun had never been one to believe in superstitions, and he was so infuriated by the persistent creature that he threw it into Qin Ping'an's yard in a fit of rage. Much to his bewilderment, he discovered that very same four-legged snake lying curled up under his bed the very next day. Song Jisun felt Ji Gui tug on his sleeve, and there seemed to be a tacit understanding between them as he immediately knew what she wanted and refrained from articulating what he was about to say next. What he wanted to say was that the hideous four-legged snake had recently developed a bulge on its forehead, as if a horn were growing there. Instead, he said something else. "Jigue and I are probably going to be leaving this place next month." Qin Ping'an heaved a faint sigh in response. "Look after yourselves. There are some things that I definitely won't be able to take with me. You'd better not steal anything while I'm gone," Song Jisun said, half in jest. Qin Ping'an shook his head. Song Jisun burst into laughter as he poked Qin Ping'an with his finger with a mischievous grin on his face. "You're such a coward. No wonder impoverished clans never produce noble sons. Not only are you destined to be bullied and derided by others in this lifetime, you'll probably suffer the same fate in your next life as well." Qin Ping'an offered no response to this. The two young boys returned to their respective homes, and Qin Ping'an closed the door as he laid down on his plank bed, then closed his eyes as he quietly murmured to himself, "May there be peace all year round. May there be safety all year round. May I be safe and peaceful all year round." Dawn was only just breaking, and Qin Ping'an had already gotten up even before the roosters began to crow. His thin blanket didn't do a very good job of keeping him warm, and he had developed the habit of waking up early and going to bed late back when he was learning to become a potter. He opened the door before stepping out onto the soft and loamy soil in the courtyard outside, then took a deep breath. After stretching out his body, he made his way out of the courtyard and turned to discover a thin and frail figure. It was none other than Song Jisun's maidservant, and she was huddled over, trying to open the gate of the neighboring courtyard with her shoulder while carrying a bucket of water with both hands. It seemed that she had just drawn some water from the Iron Lock well on Apricot Blossom Alley. Qin Ping'an withdrew his gaze as he jogged through a series of streets and alleys toward the eastern side of the small town. Clay Vase Alley was situated in the westernmost part of the town, and at the town gate in the easternmost part of the town was a man who was responsible for conducting nightly patrols and overseeing the merchants and visitors entering and exiting the town. On the side, he would also receive and deliver some letters sent to the town, and Qin Ping'an's job was to take those letters and deliver them to the town's residents for 1 copper coin per letter. This was an avenue of income that he had gone to great lengths to obtain, and it had already been arranged that he was going to be taking over this job after the day of the Longtata festival. In Song Jisun's words, Qin Ping'an was destined to lead an impoverished life, and even if the winds of fortune were to blow into his home, he wouldn't be able to keep them anyway. Song Jisun often said some things that were very difficult to understand. He most likely took those esoteric sayings from the books that he read, and Qin Ping'an was frequently left scratching his head in befuddlement. For example, a few days ago, Song Jisun had been saying something along the lines of, "Beware of the spring chill, for it has been the death of many a young man," and Qin Ping'an had no idea what that meant. However, he had first-hand experience with this strange phenomenon where the initial period of spring felt colder than the winter each year. Song Jisun referred to this phenomenon as the unexpected spring chill, which caught many people off guard before claiming their lives, much like a sudden and unforeseen retaliation from an opponent on the battlefield. The town wasn't surrounded by any walls, so even bandits and gangs were a problem, let alone petty thieves. The so-called town gate was actually nothing more than a row of old and uneven fencing materials, acting as a makeshift checkpoint for people and carriages to pass through in order to keep up appearances for the town. While jogging past Apricot Blossom Alley, Qin Ping'an spotted many women and children huddled around the iron lock well, and the well winch was creaking incessantly. After passing through another street, Qin Ping'an heard the familiar sound of reading ringing out nearby. There was a private school there, and it was jointly funded by several of the most affluent clans in the town. The teacher was from out of town, and back in Qin Ping'an's younger days, he would often squat down outside the window and listen to the lesson being taught in secret. The teacher was very strict during classes, but he never called out or got in the way of freeloaders like Qin Ping'an. After that, Qin Ping'an traveled out of the town to become a disciple at a dragon kiln, and he hadn't visited the school since then. Jogging ahead a bit further, Qin Ping'an passed by a stone archway. Due to the fact that the archway was supported by 12 stone pillars, the local residents liked to refer to it as the Crab Archway. As for what the archway's actual name was, Song Jisun and Lu Xianyang had very different accounts. Song Jisun swore that he had read in an old book by the name of Local County Chronicles that the archway was called the Grand Secretary Archway, and that it had been bestowed upon the town by the emperor at the time to commemorate an official in history who had made significant contributions in overseeing military forces. In contrast, Lu Xianyang was just as much of a hillbilly as Qin Ping'an, and he insisted that this place was known as the Crab Archway. It had been referred to as such for several centuries, and in his eyes, there was no reason to give it a nonsensical name like the Grand Secretary Archway. In addition to that, Lu Xianyang had also posed a question to Song Jisun. How big is the official hat of a Grand Secretary? Is it bigger than the opening of the Iron Lock Well? Song Jisun had no answer to this, and he was left flushing furiously with embarrassment. Qin Ping'an ran a lap around the 12-pillar archway, and each side bore 4 large characters inscribed in strange fonts, all of which appeared to be different from one another. The inscriptions read, "Doing my part, comply with the natural order, refrain from looking outward, and unmatched aura." According to Song Jisun, aside from one of those inscriptions, all 3 of the other inscriptions had been smeared or altered at some point. Qin Ping'an was quite clueless about these matters, and he had never given this notion much deep thought. Of course, even if he had wanted to unearth some answers, he wouldn't have been able to. Even now, he still didn't know what kind of book the local county chronicles that Song Jisun frequently mentioned was supposed to be. Shortly after passing the archway, he saw an old yet lush locust tree, at the foot of which was a tree trunk that had been moved there by someone. Slight modifications had been made to the tree trunk, and there were 2 bluestone slabs tucked under either end of it, transforming it into a crude bench. Every summer, all of the town's residents liked to gather under the tree to stay cool. Some of the adults from the wealthier clans would pull baskets of chilled fruits and melons out of the well for the children to eat, and once they'd had their fill of fruits, the children would band together and play under the shade of the tree. Qin Ping'an was already accustomed to rigorous travel, so he wasn't even out of breath as he jogged over to the makeshift town gate before stopping at the entrance of the lone earthen cabin. Not many outsiders visited the town. Now that the town had been deprived of a major source of income in the form of the official kills, it stood to reason that there would be even fewer visitors from outside. Back when Old Man Yao was around, There was one time when he had a little too much to drink, and he told his disciples, including Qin Pinyin and Lu Xianyang, that they were the only ones under the heavens manning official kills. That the Chinaware that they produced was imperial ware used by the emperor and the empress, that no matter how rich or lofty in official status someone was, they would be beheaded if they dared to use imperial ware themselves. On that day, old man Ya had seemed like a completely different person. As Qin Pinyin cast his gaze out of the town gate, he was surprised to discover that there were 7 or 8 people waiting outside, and there were people of both genders and all ages among them. Furthermore, they were all unfamiliar to him. The local residents very rarely went through the eastern gate, regardless of whether they were tending to their fields or going to their kills. The reason for this was very simple. The path leading out of the town's eastern gate didn't lead to any kills or plots of farmland. At this moment, Qin Pinyin and these outsiders were looking across at each other, separated by the makeshift gate. Qin Pinyin was wearing a pair of straw sandals woven by himself, and he was very envious of the thick clothing worn by the people outside. In his eyes, the clothes looked very warm and were sure to be great for keeping out the cold. The people outside the town gate were clearly split up into several groups, rather than belonging to one large group, but all of them wore aloof and indifferent expressions as they looked at Qin Pinyin. A couple of them had already looked past him and were peering further into the town. Qin Pinyin was rather perplexed to see this. Could it be that these people weren't aware that the imperial court had already shut down all of the dragon kills in the village? Alternatively, could it be that they felt like there was an opportunity to be exploited here because they knew the true reason for the closure of the kills? There was a young man wearing a strange tall hat in the group. He was tall and slim with a green jade pendant hanging from his waist, and he seemed to have grown tired of waiting. The gate had no lock, and he emerged from the crowd on his own as if he were going to push it open, but right as his finger was about to come into contact with the gate, he suddenly stopped before slowly withdrawing his hand, then clasped his hands behind his back as he cast his gaze toward Qin Pinyin with a smile on his face. He didn't say anything. All he did was smile. Out of his peripheral vision, Qin Pinyin inadvertently noticed that the people behind the young man seemed to all be displaying different emotions. Some were disappointed, some were amused, some had their brows furrowed, and some were looking on with derision in their eyes. Right at this moment, a middle-aged man with a head of disheveled hair abruptly opened the gate, then erupted into a loud tirade directed at Qin Pinyin. "How desperate for money are you little bastard? Who in their right mind would come here at such an ungodly hour? Are you rushing off to reunite with your dead parents?" Qin Pinyin rolled his eyes in response, completely unfazed by the man's scathing words. He was living in a rural area filled with uneducated people. If he allowed himself to get mad every time someone directed some insults at him, then he might as well jump into a well and put himself out of his misery. In addition, this middle-aged gatekeeper was often the butt of jokes for the residents of the town himself. In particular, the bold and feisty women would not just verbally abuse him, but often hit him as well. The man was also always going around boasting to little kids who were still in their open crotch pants, telling them about how back in his heyday, he had once beaten up 5 or 6 burly men at once in front of the town gate, dishing out such a severe beating that his assailants were left to pick up their teeth from the ground, and that there was so much blood everywhere that the entire 20-foot wide path in front of the town gate had become as muddy as if it had just rained. "We'll discuss your shitty job later," the man said to Qin Pinyin in a disgruntled voice. No one in the town held any respect for him, but he was the one who decided whether outsiders could enter the town or not. He made his way toward the makeshift gate while reaching a hand down into his own pants. His back was facing Qin Pinyin, and after opening the door, he would take a small embroidered pouch from each of the people outside, then stow the pouches up his sleeve before granting them passage into the town. Qin Pinyin had already stepped aside to let the people through, and the 8 outsiders made their way into the town, roughly split up into 5 groups. 2 children who were around 7 or 8 years of age strode into the town on either side of the young man with the green jade pendant strapped to his waist. The pair of children consisted of a boy and a girl, and the former was wearing a festive red robe, while the little girl was as fair and delicate as a piece of premium porcelain. The boy was almost a full head shorter than Chen Ping'an, and as he passed by Chen Ping'an, he opened his mouth, but didn't say anything. However, it was quite apparent that he had mouthed something very rude and provocative. The middle-aged woman holding onto the boy's hand cleared her throat quietly, and only then did the boy display some restraint. As for the little girl behind the boy and the woman, she was being led by a physically imposing elderly man with a head of white hair. She turned to Chen Ping'an and immediately began chatting away while pointing at the boy up ahead. Chen Ping'an couldn't understand anything that she was saying, but he could tell that she was complaining about the boy. The burly old man took a glance at Chen Ping'an out of the corner of his eye, and it was only a fleeting glance without any intention or malice, but Chen Ping'an reflexively took a step backward, as if he were a mouse that had run into a cat. The chatty little girl's enthusiasm was instantly snuffed out upon seeing this, and she turned away from Chen Ping'an without affording him so much as a second glance, as if looking at him would be an insult to her eyes. Chen Ping'an didn't have much life experience, but he wasn't so clueless that he couldn't read faces. After those people had faded into the distance, the gatekeeper turned to Chen Ping'an before asking, "Do you want to know what they said?" "I do," Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. The middle-aged gatekeeper chuckled. "They were praising you for your good looks. They were all saying good things about you." Chen Ping'an gave a wry smile in response. "Do I look stupid to you?" The gatekeeper could tell what Chen Ping'an was thinking, and he began to laugh even more boisterously. "If you weren't stupid, I wouldn't have asked you to come and deliver letters." Chen Ping'an didn't dare to rebuke the gatekeeper for fear of irking him and losing this job. The gatekeeper turned and cast his gaze toward the outsiders, stroking his stubbly chin as he mused to himself, "That woman just now had a pair of killer legs." Chen Ping'an hesitated momentarily before asking with an intrigued expression, "Is she a martial arts practitioner?" The gatekeeper was rather taken aback by this innocent response, and he turned to Chen Ping'an with a serious expression as he said, "You really are a stupid kid." Chen Ping'an was still none the wiser. The gatekeeper asked Chen Ping'an to wait outside as he made his way into the cabin, then re-emerged with a stack of letters in his hand. It wasn't a particularly thick stack, consisting of only around 10 letters, and the man handed the letters over to Chen Ping'an before asking, "It said that fortune favors the foolish and karma favors the righteous. Do you believe in that?" Chen Ping'an grabbed the letters with one hand while spreading open his other hand, blinking innocently as he said, "You promised me 1 copper coin per letter." The gatekeeper pulled out the 5 copper coins that he had prepared earlier in a disgruntled fashion before slamming them down heavily onto Chen Ping'an's palm, then gave him a dismissive wave as he said, "I'll give you the remaining 5 copper coins some other time." The town wasn't very large, home to fewer than 700 clans, and Chen Ping'an knew the majority of the impoverished clans in the town. As for the wealthy clans, they were too far above a poor hillbilly like him. In fact, Chen Ping'an hadn't even set foot in any of the wide and spacious alleys where some of the wealthy clans resided in clusters. Those streets were mostly paved with large bluestone slabs, so there was no risk of having to slosh through mud even on rainy days. After centuries of being trodden on by people, horses, and carriages, the high-quality bluestone slabs had already been polished to the point that they were as smooth as mirrors. Lu, Li, Zhao, and Song were the most prominent surnames in the town, and it was those clans who had pooled together the funds to open the private school. Each of those clans owned 2 or 3 large dragon kilns outside the town, and all of the past kiln supervision officials had lived on the same street as them. Coincidentally, almost all 10 letters that Chen Ping'an had been tasked with delivering were addressed to the renowned affluent clans in the town. However, this was quite a reasonable occurrence. As the saying went, the offspring of dragons and phoenixes were destined to soar in the heavens, while the offspring of mice could only burrow in the dirt. Those who were traveling far away and were able to send letters back to their families had to have come from privileged backgrounds. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had the courage and financial backing to go to such faraway places. For 9 of the 10 letters, Chen Ping'an only had to go to 2 places, namely Fortune Deer Street and Peach Leaf Alley. The bluestone slabs that paved these streets were as large as bedsteads, and he felt rather uneasy as he stepped onto them for the first time. He unconsciously slowed down and was struck by a sense of inferiority, feeling as if he were soiling the ground with his straw sandals. The first letter that he delivered was to the Liu clan, which had an ancestor who had received a jade scepter bestowed upon them by the emperor. As he stood outside the doors of the Liu manor, he was becoming more and more agitated and uneasy. Wealthy clans were very particular about many things. Not only was the Liu manor massive, there were 2 stone lions placed on either side of the entrance, both of which were as tall as a grown man, presenting a rather intimidating sight to behold. According to Song Jisun, these things were capable of warding off malicious and evil entities. Qin Ping'an had no idea what these malicious and evil entities were supposed to be. He was only very intrigued by the round stone ball that each of the stone lions held in their mouths, wondering how those balls had been sculpted. He forcibly suppressed the urge to touch those stone balls, then made his way up the steps before using the bronze lion head knockers on the doors. A young man quickly made his way out of the manor, and upon hearing that Qin Ping'an was here to deliver a letter, the man pinched a corner of the letter between 2 of his fingers and took it from Qin Ping'an in an expressionless manner. He then quickly strode back into the manor before closing the doors, which bore a colorful visage of the god of wealth. The letter delivery process after this proved to be just as mundane and uneventful. On the corner of Peach Leaf Alley was a lesser-known clan, and Qin Ping'an was greeted by a benevolent-looking old man of a rather short and small stature. The man accepted the letter with a smile, then said, "You're working hard, young lad. Would you like to come in for some rest and a sip of warm water?" Qin Ping'an shook his head with a bashful smile in response before jogging away. The old man gently tucked the letter into his sleeve, but instead of returning to his courtyard right away, he raised his head and cast a pair of slightly murky eyes into the distance. He looked up, then down, then peered into the distance before withdrawing his gaze, staring at the peach trees that lined the street, following which a faint smile appeared on his face. The old man turned to depart, and shortly thereafter, a small oriole with adorable colors landed on the tip of one of the peach tree's branches, chirping gently as it did so. The final letter that Qin Ping'an had to deliver was addressed to the teacher at the private school. Along the way, he passed by a fortune teller's stall, where a young Taoist priest in an old Taoist robe was seated behind a table with his back ramrod straight. He was wearing a tall hat that resembled a blooming lotus flower. Right as Qin Ping'an was jogging past, the young Taoist priest hurriedly called out to him, "Don't miss out on a reading, young man. Pick out a stick and I'll tell your fortune. I can help you predict whether fortune or peril awaits you." Qin Ping'an continued to jog past without pause, but he turned to the Taoist priest and waved a hand in refusal. The Taoist priest was unwilling to give up, and he leaned forward slightly as he raised his voice and continued, "How about this, young man? I normally charge 10 copper coins for a reading, but today, I'll make an exception and only charge you 3 copper coins. Of course, if you pick out a good stick, you're free to pay a little extra for good fortune. Even if you're fortunate enough to pick out the best stick possible, I'll only charge you 5 copper coins. What do you say?" Qin Ping'an had already jogged into the distance at this point, but he clearly faltered slightly in his footsteps. The young Taoist priest instantly jumped on the opportunity, quickly rising to his feet as he declared, "It's still very early in the morning, so you'll be my first customer, young man. In light of that, I'll do you an additional favor. If you sit down for a reading, I'll write up some yellow paper talismans for you and help you pray to your ancestors so you can accumulate some good karma. With my skills, I wouldn't dare to guarantee that you'll be reincarnated into a wealthy clan in your next life, but I can certainly try and bless you with a bit of good fortune." Qin Ping'an faltered slightly upon hearing this, then turned back around with a skeptical expression before taking a seat on the bench in front of the stall. Thus, a modest Taoist priest and an impoverished young man found themselves seated across from one another, each of them just as poor as the other. The Taoist priest smiled as he extended a hand, inviting Qin Ping'an to pick up the tube of bamboo sticks. However, Qin Ping'an didn't hesitate even for a moment as he declared, "I don't want to draw a stick. All I want is for you to write up a yellow paper talisman for me. Can you do that?" Qin Ping'an recalled that this young traveling Taoist priest had already been staying in this town for at least the past 5 or 6 years. His appearance hadn't changed much during that time, and he was always quite friendly to everyone. On a normal day, all he did was tell people's fortunes through scapulomancy, face reading, and stick drawing, and he also occasionally acted as a letter ghostwriter for others. What was rather interesting was that there were 108 bamboo sticks in the tube on the table, but during all his time here, not a single person had managed to draw the best possible stick, nor had anyone ever drawn a stick of misfortune. It was as if there were only good or neutral sticks in the tube, with no other options available. Hence, whenever there was a festival, the residents of the town were willing to fork out 10 copper coins for a fortune reading purely for the sake of good fortune. However, no one experiencing any actual troubles would be willing to come here just to be scalped. It would be unfair to say that the Taoist priest was a complete and utter fraud. The town was not a very large place, and if all he did was intentionally confuse and defraud people, then he would have been kicked out long ago. Hence, it was clear that the young Taoist priest's forte wasn't his fortune-telling. Instead, he had made a name for himself through his amulet water, which had consistently cured many of the town's residents of various minor ailments over the years. The young Taoist priest shook his head in response. "I never go back on my word. I promised that I was going to give you a fortune reading and a yellow paper talisman for 5 copper coins." "It's 3 copper coins," Qin Pinyin argued in a low voice. "But it'll be 5 copper coins if you manage to pull the best stick," the Taoist priest chuckled. After making up his mind, Qin Pinyin reached out for the stick tube, only to suddenly raise his head as he asked, "How did you know that I just so happened to have exactly 5 copper coins on me?" The Taoist priest replied with a serious expression, "I can see if someone is blessed by fortune or not, and in particular, I've always been very accurate when it comes to my readings of one's fortune and wealth." After a brief moment of contemplation, Qin Pinyin picked up the stick tube. The Taoist priest smiled as he said, "Don't be nervous, young man. If it's meant to be, then it'll be. If it's not meant to be, then it can't be forced. Regarding impermanence with a peaceful heart is the solution to everything." Qin Pinyin set the stick tube back down onto the table, then asked with a serious expression, "How about this? I'll give you the 5 copper coins, and I won't draw a stick. All that I ask is that you write up the yellow paper talisman a bit better than you normally do. Is that possible?" The Taoist priest's smile remained unchanged, and after some thought, he nodded in response. Sure. A set of writing tools and paper had already been prepared on the table, and the Taoist priest carefully inquired to Qin Pinyin about the names, birthplaces, and birth dates and times of his parents, then pulled out a yellow paper talisman before quickly inscribing something onto it. As for what had been written, Qin Pinyin had no clue. The young Taoist priest set down his brush before picking up the talisman, then blew on it to dry the ink. "Take this home, and all you have to do is burn this outside your doorway while standing inside your doorway." Qin Pinyin accepted the talisman with a solemn expression, then carefully stowed it away as if it were a priceless treasure. He then placed 5 copper coins down onto the table before bowing in gratitude. The Taoist priest waved a dismissive hand, indicating that Qin Pinyin was free to go, and he immediately rushed away to deliver the final letter. The Taoist priest sat back lazily in his chair, then took a glance at the copper coins before bending over and scooping them close to him. Right at this moment, a small oriole flew down from the sky onto the table, gently pecking one of the copper coins before quickly losing interest and flying away again. The oriole wishes to pluck a flower, but the peach blossoms are still yet to bloom. After casually reciting that poem phrase to himself, he rustled his sleeve in a carefree manner as he sighed, "If it's not meant to be, then there's no point in forcing things." As he rustled his sleeve, 2 bamboo sticks fell out from within before clattering onto the ground. The Taoist priest yelped in alarm as he hurriedly picked up the bamboo sticks, then looked around in a sheepish manner and was very relieved to see that no one had caught sight of what had just happened. After that, he tucked the pair of bamboo sticks back into his loose and baggy sleeve. He then cleared his throat and put on a serious expression, waiting for his next customer. At the same time, he couldn't help but muse to himself that it was easier to get women to spend money on things like this. As it turned out, There were 2 bamboo sticks concealed up the Taoist priest's sleeve, one of which was the best possible stick, while the other was the worst possible stick, and both of them were reserved for earning big money. However, he never revealed this to anyone, and Chen Ping'an was naturally oblivious to these hidden machinations as well. He jogged lightly to the private school, and there was a lush and vibrant bamboo forest nearby. He slowed down outside the school, and the mellow voice of a middle-aged man rang out from inside. "The radiant sun shines down upon the pristine woolen coat." The phrase was immediately repeated in unison by a collection of tender voices. "The radiant sun shines down upon the pristine woolen coat." Chen Ping'an raised his head to find that the sun was only just beginning to rise in the east, and he was momentarily dazed. By the time he returned to his senses, he discovered that the children in the school were reciting a passage in a well-rehearsed manner as instructed by the teacher. At the time of Jingzhe, heaven and earth stirs, and all living things begin to flourish. Sleep late and wake early. Take regular strolls, do so slowly, for good health and vitality. Chen Ping'an was standing at the entrance of the school, and he wanted to say something, but refrained from doing so. The teacher was a middle-aged scholar with gray sideburns, and he gently made his way out of the room. Chen Ping'an offered the letter to him with both hands as he said in a respectful voice, "I have a letter for you, sir." The man accepted the letter, then encouraged in a warm voice, "If you have some free time, you can come here and listen to my lessons." Chen Ping'an was reluctant to make any promises. He couldn't guarantee that he would have the time to come and listen to these lessons, and he didn't want to lie to the teacher. The man gave a considerate smile as he said, "It's all right. The knowledge is all in the books, but the way to be a good person is something that needs to be learned outside of books. You can go now." Chen Ping'an heaved a faint sigh of relief before taking his leave. After a while, he was struck by the urge to turn back for some reason, even though he was already very far away from the school. The teacher was still standing at the entrance, basking under the sunlight, resembling a deity from afar. If he hadn't gone to Fortune Deer Street and Peach Leaf Alley, perhaps Chen Ping'an would have never realized just how dark and confined Clay Vase Alley was. However, not only was he not disheartened by his own living condition, he felt a sense of reassurance. He smiled as he extended both hands outward, and his wingspan was just enough so that he was able to touch the earthen walls on either side of him. He recalled that around 3 to 4 years ago, he was only able to touch those walls with the tips of his fingers. After returning to his home, he discovered that the gate of the courtyard was wide open. Thinking that he had just been robbed by a thief, Chen Ping'an hurriedly rushed inside, only to find a tall and broad young man sitting on the doorstep. He was leaning back against the locked door, yawning with a bored expression, and he immediately jumped to his feet at the sight of Chen Ping'an as if his bottom had just been scorched. He then rushed over to Chen Ping'an and grabbed tightly onto his arm before dragging him forcefully toward the room as he hissed in a low voice, "Open the door. I have something important to tell you." Chen Ping'an was unable to struggle free and could only allow himself to be dragged to the door. The young man was 2 years older than Chen Ping'an and more physically developed, and after the door was opened, he quickly threw Chen Ping'an aside before sneaking his way onto Chen Ping'an's plank bed, then pressed his ear tightly against the wall to eavesdrop on the neighbors. "What are you doing, Lu Xianyang?" Chen Ping'an asked with a curious expression. Lu Xianyang paid no heed to him, and after about 7 or 8 minutes, Lu Xianyang returned to normal before sitting down on the edge of the plank bed with a peculiar mixture of relief and disappointment on his face. Only now did he notice that Chen Ping'an was doing something rather strange. He was squatted down inside the doorway with his body leaning forward, using a candle to burn a piece of yellow paper. Only around a thumb's length of the candle remained, and all of the ashes of the burned piece of paper fell outside of the doorway. It seemed that Chen Ping'an was also chanting something, but Lu Xianyang was too far away to hear what he was saying. Lu Xianyang was Old Man Yao's best disciple. As for Chen Ping'an, Old Man Yao had never truly accepted him as a disciple due to his mediocre aptitude for the craft. According to local traditions, no master and disciple relationship could be established unless the disciple offered a cup of tea to the master in a formal ceremony, and the master accepted and drank the cup of tea. Chen Ping'an and Lu Xianyang weren't neighbors. In fact, their ancestral homes were quite far away from one another's. The reason why Lu Xianyang had recommended Qinpingyan to Old Man Yao stemmed from their past history. Lu Xianyang was once a renowned delinquent in the town. Prior to the passing of his grandfather, there was at least an adult in the household to keep him in check, but after his grandfather passed away due to illness, Lu Xianyang quickly became an absolute nightmare for his neighbors. At the time, he was only 12 or 13 years old, but he was already no less physically developed than a young man, and one time, he somehow made enemies out of a group of boys from the Lu family. As a result, he was ganged up on in Clay Vase Alley and was handed a vicious beating. His assailants were all young boys who didn't think about the consequences of their actions, and Lu Xianyang was quickly beaten to the point where he was throwing up blood. All of the dozen or so clans that resided in Clay Vase Alley were bottom-class potters who made a living by working at small dragon kills, and they didn't dare to intervene. At the time, not only was Song Jisun not frightened by this horrific scene, he was watching with glee as he squatted on top of the wall, reveling in the chaos of the situation. In the end, the only one who did anything was an emaciated child, who snuck out of his yard and rushed to the entrance of the alley, where he screamed with all his might, "Help! Someone's about to die here." Only after hearing the word "die" did the boys from the Lu family receive a rude awakening. At that point, Lu Xianyang's entire body was covered in blood, and he was on the brink of death. The boys from the Lu family finally felt a sense of fear at what they had done upon seeing this, and after exchanging a few glances with one another, they quickly fled down the other end of Clay Vase Alley. However, after that incident, not only was Lu Xianyang not grateful to the child that saved his life, he regularly came over to bully the child instead. The child was an orphan, and he was very stubborn, refusing to cry no matter how much he was bullied, something that only served to further infuriate Lu Xianyang. One year, Lu Xianyang could tell that the little orphan most likely wasn't going to be able to make it through the winter, and he was finally stung by his conscience. Having already become a disciple of Old Man Yao's at the time, he took the young boy to the dragon kiln that was situated beside Treasure Creek. They headed west out of the town, traveling over dozens of kilometers of rugged mountain terrain under heavy snowfall. To this day, Lu Xianyang still couldn't understand how the emaciated young boy with a pair of legs as thin as baby bamboo shoots had managed to walk all the way to the dragon kiln. Even though Old Man Yao ultimately took Qinpingyan in, the disparity in his treatment of the two boys was night and day. As his best disciple, Lu Xianyang wasn't spared from his beatings and insults, but even a blind man could sense the good intentions behind Old Man Yao's words and actions. For example, there was one time when he went a little too far, inflicting a bleeding gash onto Lu Xianyang's forehead. As a tough young boy, Lu Xianyang didn't think much of this, but Old Man Yao was feeling very remorseful over his actions. However, he had always kept up a stern and authoritative facade in front of his disciples, so he couldn't bring himself to apologize or inquire about his condition. In the end, he paced back and forth in his own room for almost an entire night, and he was still concerned about Lu Xianyang. Finally, he had no choice but to call over Qinpingyan to deliver a bottle of ointment to Lu Xianyang. Over the years, Qinpingyan had always been very envious of Lu Xianyang. He didn't envy Lu Xianyang for his remarkable aptitude, strength, and charisma. Instead, he envied Lu Xianyang's fearlessness. No matter where he went, Lu Xianyang was never fazed by anything, nor did he ever feel like living alone was a bad thing. Wherever he went, he was always able to quickly make friends with whoever he met, getting on such friendly terms with them that they referred to one another as brothers and would drink and play drinking games together. Due to his grandfather's ill health, Lu Xianyang was forced to become self-dependent from a very young age, making him a leader of sorts among the children in the area. He was skilled at everything, whether it be catching snakes, fishing, procuring eggs from birds' nests, making bows, fishing rods, slingshots, bird cages. It seemed like there was nothing that he couldn't do. In particular, he was the undisputed king of the town when it came to catching catfish and fishing for eels in the channels of water running through plots of farmland. Back when Lu Xianyang dropped out of the private school, the teacher there, Mr. Su, had paid a visit to Lu Xianyang's grandfather on his sickbed, offering to provide Lu Xianyang an education free of charge. However, Lu Xianyang refused to go back no matter what, telling the teacher that all he wanted to do was earn money and that he had no interest in an education. Mr. Su then offered Lu Xianyang a paid job as a scholarly attendant, but Lu Xianyang turned down that offer as well. As it turned out, Lu Xianyang was doing quite well for himself. Even though Old Man Yao had passed away and the dragon kills had been shut down, it didn't take long before he caught the eye of the blacksmith from Dragon Rider Alley, and he was currently busy building his own forge in the southern part of the town. Lu Xianyang watched as Chen Ping'an blew out the candle before setting it down on the table, then asked, "Have you heard any strange sounds in the morning?" Like. Chen Ping'an sat down on the bench, waiting for Lu Xianyang to finish. Lu Xianyang hesitated momentarily, and in an extremely rare and uncharacteristic display of embarrassment, he blushed slightly as he continued, like how cats sound during spring. "Are you saying Song Jisun is imitating a cat? Or are you talking about Ji Goe?" Chen Ping'an asked. Lu Xianyang rolled his eyes and didn't waste any more time discussing the subject with someone who was clearly completely oblivious to what he was talking about. He placed his palms down onto the bed plank, then bent his elbows slightly before straightening his arms, supporting his own weight with his hands so that his bottom lifted up from the plank and his feet were lifted up from the ground. He then pursed his lips as he sneered. "What kind of name is Ji Goe supposed to be? Her name is clearly Wang Ju." That little song brat always liked to show off ever since he was a wee little pipsqueak. He probably just saw the character Ji Goe from somewhere and decided to use it on a whim without even considering whether that name has good implications or not. Wang Ju had to have accumulated a ton of bad karma in her past life. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been reincarnated as Song Jisun's servant and been forced to lead such a miserable life. Chen Ping'an didn't echo Lu Xianyang's sentiment. Lu Xianyang was still supporting the entirety of his own weight with his hands, and he harumphed coldly as he continued, "Do you really not understand? Why is it that Wang Ju never spoke to you again after you helped her carry her water bucket that one time? It's definitely because that petty little song brat became jealous and threatened Wang Ju with violence if she ever spoke to you again. I bet he told her that not only was he going to break her legs, he was also going to throw her into Clay Vase Alley." Chen Ping'an couldn't bear to listen in silence any longer, and he interjected, "Song Jisun doesn't treat her badly." Lu Xianyang was furious to hear this. "How would you know? You don't even know the difference between good and bad." Chen Ping'an's eyes were bright and clear as he said, "Sometimes, when she's doing things in the yard, Song Jisun would occasionally read that local County Chronicles book while sitting on a stool, and she would often look at him and smile." Lu Xianyang was quite taken aback to hear this. All of a sudden, the thin plank bed snapped in half down the middle, unable to support Lu Xianyang's weight any longer, and he sat heavily down onto the ground. Chen Ping'an placed his hands onto his own head, squatting down as he heaved an exasperated sigh. Lu Xianyang scratched his head as he stood up, and he didn't apologize or express any guilt. Instead, he gave Chen Ping'an a playful kick as he grinned and said, "Get over it, it's just a crappy little bed. I'm here today to deliver a massive piece of good news to you, one that's way more valuable than this crappy bed." Chen Ping'an raised his head upon hearing this. A smug look appeared on Lu Xianyang's face as he continued. While Master Wan was out of town and passing by the creek to the south, he suddenly told me that he wanted to dig a few wells. He doesn't have enough people for the job and wants some more help, so I mentioned you to him on a whim. I told him that I know a short kid who has some decent strength, and Master Wan agreed. He wants you to go and see him in the next couple of days. Chen Ping'an immediately stood up, and he was just about to express his gratitude when Lu Xianyang raised a hand to cut him off. "Stop. No need to thank me, just remember what I've done for you." Chen Ping'an could only grimace in response. Lu Xianyang looked around and noticed a fishing rod placed on a slant in the corner, a slingshot on the windowsill, and a wooden bow hanging on the wall. He was about to say something, but refrained from doing so in the end. He took a big stride through the doorway, clearly intentionally avoiding stepping on the ashes of the burned talisman. Qin Pinyin looked on at his departing figure, and all of a sudden, Lu Xianyang turned around to face Qin Pinyin again. He then crouched down into a low stance before shuffling a few steps toward Qin Pinyin, then threw a heavy punch in his direction. After that, he stood up straight again as he withdrew his fist and chortled. Master Wan told me in private that I'll only need to practice this fist technique for a year, and I'll be able to kill someone with a single punch. He didn't seem to be satisfied with his performance, and he subsequently made a strange kicking motion as he continued. As the saying goes, a good kick to the crotch can kill a drunk donkey. Finally, Lu Xianyang pointed at his own chest with his thumb as he declared in a high and mighty manner, "While Master Wan was teaching me fist techniques, I developed some theories and insights, so I spoke to him about some things, such as my understanding of the jumping buren, which was old man Yao's trump card technique in porcelain making. Master Wan praised me, saying that I'm a generational martial arts talent. As long as you stick with me, you'll be living the good life for sure." Out of the corner of his eye, Lu Xianyang could see that Ji Gui had already entered the neighboring house, and he immediately lost all interest in keeping up his heroic act. After dropping the facade, he casually said to Qin Pinyin, "By the way, as I was passing by the old locust tree earlier, I met an old man who set up a new stall over there. He told me that he's a storyteller and that he has a bunch of interesting stories that he wants to tell us. You can go and take a look there in your free time." Qin Pinyin nodded in response, and Lu Xianyang departed from Clay Vase Alley. There were many stories about the unruly young man going around in the town. However, the story that he personally liked to perpetuate was that his ancestor was a general who led armies in battle, which was why there was a prized suit of armor that had been passed down for generations in his clan. Qin Pinyin had seen this supposed prized suit of armor once, and it was extremely hideous, like a suit of warts, or like the scarred and mottled surface of an old tree. However, Lu Xianyang's contemporaries told a completely different story. They proclaimed that Lu Xianyang's ancestor was a deserter who had fled to the town and became a live-in son-in-law to a family here, and that he only managed to avoid being captured by authorities thanks to a huge stroke of fortune. They were extremely convinced of the authenticity of the story, as if they had personally witnessed how Lu Xianyang's ancestor had fled the battlefield before traveling to the small town. After some contemplation, Qin Pinyin crouched down beside his doorstep and lowered his head to blow away the ashes. Before he knew it, Song Jisun had appeared on the other side of the wall with Ji Gui in accompaniment, and he yelled, "Wanna come play with us at the locust tree?" "I'll pass," Qin Pinyin replied as he raised his head. "What a spoilsport," Song Jisun grumbled with a displeased expression. He then put on a smile as he turned to Ji Gui and said, "Let's go, Ji Gui. I'll buy you a whole temple jar of peach blossom powder." "Just a small cricket jar's worth is enough," Ji Gui responded with a shy expression. Song Jisun clasped his hands behind his back, taking large strides forward with his head raised and his chest puffed out as he declared, "Our Song family has been living in luxury and affluence for generations. I would be bringing shame to my clan if I were to be so stingy." Qin Pinyin sat down on his doorstep as he rubbed his own forehead in exasperation. When he wasn't talking nonsense, Song Jisun actually wasn't a bad person to be around. However, at times like this, if Lu Xianyang were here, he would have definitely expressed to Qin Pinyin an urge to smash a brick into the back of Song Jisun's head. Qin Pinyin leaned against his doorframe as he thought about what the next day was going to be like. It was most likely going to be just like this day, and the day after the next day was going to be just like the next day. In his mind, he was going to live out his life in this repetitive cycle until he passed away just like old man Yao. Everyone relied on the earth for sustenance for their entire life, but upon their death, they would be devoured by the earth in return. After closing one's eyes for the final time, the next time one reopened their eyes, they could be in the next life already. Qin Pinyin looked down at the straw sandals on his feet, and a smile suddenly appeared on his face. It was definitely a different feeling to step on bluestone slabs rather than soppy mud. After leaving the alley, Lu Xianyang was just passing by the fortune teller's stall when the young Taoist priest called out to him, "Come, young man. I can see that you have the complexion of a fire fueled by oil. That's definitely not a good omen. But do not fear, I have a way to help you avert disaster. Lu Xianyang was rather surprised to hear this. He knew that this Taoist priest had always been telling people's fortunes based on the sticks that they drew and setting aside whether his fortune-telling was accurate or not. Lu Xianyang couldn't ever recall an instance where the Taoist priest had actively tried to rope in customers. Almost all of his customers had voluntarily gone to him. Could it be that with the closing of the Dragon Kills, the Taoist priest's business was also impacted and he was struggling to get by, thereby leading him to go after all potential customers with discretion? Lu Xianyang chuckled in disdain. The way you're going to help me avert disaster is by having me give you money, right? Piss off. You're never getting a single copper coin out of my pocket. The young Taoist priest remained calm and collected as he yelled out, "Everyone hopes for fortune and prosperity, but who knows what troubles life has in store? People only turn to the gods when things go wrong, but to have a safe and stable life, one should regularly offer burning incense to the gods." Lu Xianyang suddenly turned around before rushing toward the fortune-telling stall like the wind, putting on a menacing display as he scoffed, "You want me to burn incense? How about I burn down your stall first?" The Taoist priest was clearly very much intimidated by this threat, and he immediately turned and fled, leaving his stall behind. Lu Xianyang stood beside the stall, chortling with mirth at the sight of the Taoist priest's cowardly display. He then spotted the bamboo tube on the table and casually pushed it over. All of the bamboo sticks inside were instantly tipped out, fanning themselves out across the table. Lu Xianyang pointed at the Taoist priest, who had stopped in the distance, and threatened, "From now on, I'm gonna beat you up every time I see you." The young Taoist priest could cup his fist and bow as he begged for mercy. Lu Xianyang was finally willing to let him off the hook. Only after Lu Xianyang had gone far away did the Taoist priest dare to return to his seat, and he sighed, "These are difficult times. People are no longer as kind and accepting as they used to be, and it's getting harder and harder to make a living." Right at this moment, his eyes suddenly lit up, and he hurriedly closed his eyes as he recited, "One often blames external distractions for spoiling their peace, but the true distraction comes from within. Achievements are nothing more than lily pads on water, going whichever way the wind blows." The pair of youths passing by clearly heard him, but unfortunately, they displayed no intention of stopping. The Taoist priest opened his eyes ever so slightly, and seeing that more potential customers were about to pass him by, he hurriedly slammed a palm down onto his table as he raised his voice and continued, "Champion scholars and prime ministers were nothing more than normal people before their rise to glory. With great knowledge comes great renown and confidence." Song Jisun and Ji Gui continued onward without pause. The Taoist priest was greatly disheartened by this, and he murmured to himself, "It's over." All of a sudden, Song Jisun turned around without any warning before tossing the Taoist priest a copper coin from afar with a bright smile. "Thanks for your blessings." The Taoist priest hurriedly caught the coin before spreading his hand open and taking a look, only to discover that it was the smallest money value copper coin possible, and his mood wasn't lifted at all. The Taoist priest gently placed the copper coin down onto the table, and all of a sudden, an oriole quickly flew down onto the table, gently pecking at the copper coin before picking it up with its beak. It then looked up at the Taoist priest with a pair of bright and intelligent eyes that were no different from a human's. The Taoist priest sighed, "Go. This is not the place for you." The oriole departed in a flash. The Taoist priest swept his gaze over his surroundings, and in the end, his eyes settled on the tall archway in the distance. He just so happened to be facing the plaque that read, "Unmatched Aura," and he mused, "What a pity." He then added, "If I could take this outside to sell it, surely it would fetch at least 800 to 1,000 taels of silver." After arriving at the locust tree with Shigue, Song Jisun discovered that it was extremely packed, with close to 100 people gathered under the tree's shade. He sat down onto the stool that he had brought over from home, and there were still more children dragging their adult family members to get in on the fun. Song Jisun and Ji Gui stood side by side at the edge of the tree's shadow, and he spotted an old man standing at the foot of the tree. The man was holding a large white bowl in one hand with his other hand clasped behind his back, and he wore a vehement expression as he loudly declared, "Just now, I spoke about the general direction of the dragon vein. Now, let me tell you about the true dragon." This is a truly amazing story. Around 3,000 years ago, an almighty deity appeared under the heavens. First, he cultivated patiently in a certain blessed paradise, and after attaining the great Tao, he explored the world on his own with his sword by his side. With his 3-foot medal in his hand, his prowess was unmatched. For some reason, he had a vendetta against dragons, and he spent 3 entire centuries hunting for dragons, only stopping after there was no longer a single true dragon in the world. In the end, he disappeared without a trace. Some speculated that he had gone to an extremely high plane where the Great Tao originated to discuss Taoism with the patriarch of Taoism himself. Some said that he had gone to the extremely distant western Pure Land of Sukhavati to discuss scriptures and Buddhism with the Buddha. There are even some who say that he's personally stationed at the gates of the underworld to prevent malicious wraiths and spirits from wreaking havoc upon the human plane. The old man was speaking with such vigor and enthusiasm that spittle was flying everywhere out of his mouth, but all of the town residents around him were looking on with lost and befuddled expressions. "What's a 3-foot medal?" Jigui asked with a curious expression. "It's a sword," Song Jisun replied with a smile. "This old man is way too pretentious and full of himself. He can't even speak properly," Jigui grumbled. Song Jisun was looking at the old man with schadenfreude in his eyes as he said, "Barely anyone in our town even knows how to read. This storyteller's efforts are completely wasted here." Jigui then asked, "What is a blessed paradise? Does there really exist someone in this world that can live for 300 years? Also, isn't the underworld a place that only dead people go to?" Song Jisun was stumped by these questions, but he didn't want to look stupid, so he said in a dismissive voice, "It's all nonsense." He probably read a few obscure unofficial historical texts and is regurgitating what he read to swindle uneducated hillbillies. Right at this moment, Song Jisun noticed that the old man took a glance at him. It was unclear whether the glance was intentional or not, and it was only a very fleeting glance before his gaze was directed elsewhere, but Song Jisun was still sufficiently perceptive to have sensed it. However, he didn't think anything of it, merely chalking it up to a coincidence. Jigui raised her head to look up at the old locust tree, and she reflexively narrowed her eyes against the fragmented rays of light filtering through the gaps in the tree's canopy. Song Jisun turned to look at her, and he was abruptly transfixed. Jigui had a side facial profile that was only just beginning to graduate from its baby fat stage. She was far different from the thin and emaciated little maidservant in Song Jisun's memories. According to the traditions of the town, whenever a woman was married, an individual with a full set of blessings would be invited. The definition of such an individual was one whose parents and children were all still alive, and that person would be invited to shave off the fine hairs on the bride's face, as well as to trim her bangs and temples. The procedure was known as face opening or brow elevating. Song Jisun had also read about a tradition that didn't exist in the town from a book. Hence, when Jigui was 12 years old, he bought the best newly brewed wine in the town, then brought out the porcelain vase that he had hidden away. The coloration of the vase was extremely beautiful, resembling a greengage, and he poured the wine into the vase before carefully sealing it in clay and burying it underground. Song Jisun suddenly said, "When it comes to Qinpingin, my scholar ancestors would say that he's a piece of rotten wood that can't be carved, or a pile of manure that can't be built up into a wall, but at the very least, he's done one meaningful thing in his life." Jigui offered no response as she lowered her head, and it could be seen that her eyelashes were trembling slightly. Song Jisun continued speaking, almost as if he were talking to himself. "Qinpingin is not a bad person, he's just way too dogmatic in his personality. There's no flexibility in the way he does things. That's why after becoming a potter, no matter how hard he worked, it was predestined that he would never be able to create a good product with any flair or spark. That's also why Old Man Yao never took a liking to him. He was a man with a keen eye, and he knew that Qinpingin simply wasn't cut out for this." That's what it means for him to be a piece of rotten wood that can't be carved. As for a pile of manure that can't be molded into a wall, what that basically means is that for someone meant to be impoverished like Chen Ping'an, even if you dress him up in the emperor's dragon robes, he'll still just be a good-for-nothing hillbilly. A self-deprecating look appeared on Song Jisun's face here, and he sighed, "I'm actually even more pitiful than him." Ji Gui didn't know how to console him. Song Jisun and Ji Gui had always been a popular subject for gossip for the affluent clans on Fortune Deer Street and Peach Leaf Alley, and that was primarily thanks to Master Song, Song Jisun's illegitimate father. There weren't any important figures in the town, nor were there any exciting events. Hence, the kiln supervision official sent by the imperial court naturally became the most prominent figure in the town, much like the all-powerful judges seen in stage plays. Out of the dozens of kiln supervision officials that had been assigned to the town throughout history, Master Song was the most popular with the people. He wasn't like the high and mighty officials that came before him. He didn't hide away in his official manner to work on personal cultivation, nor did he turn away all visitors and focus solely on reading and self-education. Instead, he always attended to matters related to the creation of imperial ware in person, and he was even more like a commoner than the potters working at the kilns. During the dozen or so years in which he was at the town, his original scholarly appearance had been replaced by a dark tan, and his regular attire was no different from what was worn by the men working in the fields. He never put on a high and mighty front when dealing with others, but unfortunately, the imperial ware fired using the dragon kilns in the town were never quite up to standard, regardless of whether it was in terms of shape and form, or their coloration and glaze. In fact, the imperial ware that was produced had regressed compared with before, much to the puzzlement of the old kiln masters. In the end, the imperial court most likely felt like Master Song's efforts were very commendable, even though the outcome wasn't ideal. And he was given a decent evaluation on the documentation from the Ministry of Personnel, summoning him back to the capital. Prior to returning to the capital, Master Song spent all of his money to fund the construction of a covered bridge. After that, it was discovered that a certain child wasn't brought along on the convoy that Master Song had departed in, and the most affluent clans in the town immediately realized what this entailed. It could be said that Master Song had accumulated a great deal of good karma in the town, and in addition to that, Song Jisun was being looked after by Master Song's kiln supervision official successor, so he didn't have to worry about food, clothing, or shelter, and led a carefree life. As for his maidservant, whose name had been changed to Ji Gui, there were many different theories and stories about her origins. The local residents of Clay Vase Alley claimed that she was a little beggar from out of town that had come to this place on a snowy winter's day. She had fallen unconscious in front of the entrance of Song Jisun's courtyard, and if she hadn't been discovered in time, she would have already passed on to the afterlife. The old man taking care of menial chores at the official manor had a different story. He proclaimed with great confidence that she was an orphan that Master Song had purchased quite some time ago so that his illegitimate son, Song Jisun, would have an intimate companion, and that he had done this to compensate for leaving his son behind. In any case, after the maidservant was named Ji Gui by Song Jisun, the father and son relationship between Song Jisun and Master Song was confirmed beyond a doubt. This was because all of the most affluent individuals in the town knew that the characters Ji Gui were engraved onto Master Song's favorite inkstone. After returning to his senses, a bright smile appeared on Song Jisun's face. For some reason, the thought of that tenacious four-legged snake just crossed my mind. Think about it, Ji Gui. I already threw that thing into Chen Ping'an's yard, yet it still crawled into our home. How terrible of a place must Chen Ping'an's den be if even a little snake didn't want to stay there? Ji Gui considered the question carefully before replying. Perhaps some things are simply down to fate. Song Jisun gave her a thumbs up as he happily agreed. That's exactly right. Chen Ping'an is just someone who isn't blessed with any fortune. He should be satisfied with just being alive. Ji Gui didn't say anything. Song Jisun mused to himself, after we leave the town, Chen Ping'an will look after everything in our house. Do you think he'd steal what was entrusted to him? Surely not, young master, Ji Gui replied. Oh, you know what it means to steal what's entrusted to someone? Song Jisun asked with a smile. Ji Gui blinked innocently as she replied, doesn't it just mean what it says? Song Jisun smiled as he cast his gaze toward the south, and a hint of longing appeared on his face. I heard that there are more books in the capital than there are plants in our town. Right at this moment, the storyteller declared, there are no longer any true dragons left in the world, but dragonkin such as flood dragons, drakes, and hornless dragons still truly exist among us in this world, and perhaps. The old man intentionally paused here to try and build some suspense, but the audience remained unmoved, completely oblivious to what he was doing, so he could only continue. Perhaps they're hidden right among us. The deities of Taoism refer to them as dragons lurking in plain sight. Song Jisun gave a bored yawn. All of a sudden, a vibrant, green locust leaf came fluttering down from above, and it just so happened to land on his forehead. Song Jisun grabbed the leaf and twirled its stem in between two of his fingers. Qin Ping'an was considering whether he should go to the eastern town gate to ask for the 5 copper coins that he was owed, and he also saw a locust leaf fluttering down as he approached the old locust tree. He immediately sped up and reached out to try and catch the leaf, but the leaf glanced past his hand, carried away by a gentle breeze. Qin Ping'an was quite agile, and he quickly took a step to the side to try and intercept the leaf, but it continued to evade him as it twirled around in the air. Qin Ping'an refused to give up, making a few more attempts, but was ultimately unable to catch the leaf, much to his dismay. An azure-robed young boy that was flunking his lessons at the private school passed by Qin Ping'an, and unbeknownst to him, a locust leaf had landed on his shoulder. Meanwhile, Qin Ping'an continued on toward the eastern town gate. Even if he couldn't get the money, it was always definitely a good idea to exert some pressure on the gatekeeper. Over at the fortune-telling stall in the distance, the young Taoist priest murmured to himself, who says there's a disparity in the cycle of fortune? Upon arriving at the eastern gate, Qin Ping'an spotted the gatekeeper sitting on the tree stump at the gate with his legs crossed, lazily basking under the early spring sun. His eyes were closed, and he was humming a tune while patting his knees with his hands. Qin Ping'an squatted down next to him. For him, it was very difficult to ask for the money that he was owed. Hence, he could only cast his gaze toward the wide path in the east in silence. It was a long and winding road that resembled a thick yellow snake. He habitually grabbed a handful of dirt and held it in his hand, massaging it slowly. In the past, he had traveled extensively around the town with Old Man Yao, carrying heavy bags that were filled to the brim with all types of things, such as machetes and hoes. Old Man Yao had taken him to many different places, and during their travels, Qin Ping'an was often made to eat dirt, which involved picking up a handful of dirt and placing it directly into his mouth before chewing it to carefully savor its flavor. Over time, Qin Ping'an became more proficient at the skill, and he was able to glean the properties of any soil that he came into contact with just by massaging it between his fingers. In fact, he became so skilled at this that all he had to do was weigh up some broken porcelain fragments on the market with his hand, and he would be able to tell which kiln the porcelain had come from, and even which master it had been fired by. Old Man Yao was a loner who could be quite inhumane at times, often beating and insulting Qin Ping'an. There was one time when Old Man Yao became so disgusted by how little talent and aptitude Qin Ping'an had that he abandoned him in the wilderness in a fit of rage before returning to the kiln alone. By the time Qin Ping'an navigated the 60 kilometers of mountain terrain back to the dragon kiln, it was already very late at night. It had been raining heavily that day, and after finally spotting a hint of light in the distance after trudging through the mud for hours, the stubborn and resilient Qin Ping'an was struck by the urge to cry for the first time. However, Qin Ping'an had never resented or hated Old Man Yao. He came from a very impoverished background and had never received an education, but he understood a principle that wasn't taught in books, which was that aside from your parents, no one in the world had a duty to be good to you. And his parents had passed away very early in his life. Qin Ping'an had the patience to stick around in silence, and it seemed that the gatekeeper could sense that he wouldn't be able to get out of this just by ignoring him. Hence, he opened his eyes and smiled as he said, Get over it, it's just 5 copper coins. A young man shouldn't be so petty. Otherwise, you'll never make anything out of yourself. Aren't you being petty here? Qin Ping'an countered with an exasperated expression. That's exactly right. If you don't want to end up like me, then forget about those 5 copper coins, the gatekeeper chuckled, grinning to reveal a mouthful of crooked yellow teeth. Qin Ping'an heaved a faint sigh as he raised his head and said in a serious manner, if you're a little tight on money right now, then I can do without the 5 copper coins. But we agreed upon 1 copper coin per letter, so you can't keep refusing to pay me like this. The gatekeeper's entire body was giving off a sour and rotten odor, and he grinned as he said, if you keep up that stinky attitude of yours, there's a very good chance that you're going to get in big trouble in the future. Have you not heard the saying that suffering a loss is a blessing? If you're not willing to suffer even minor losses. He paused momentarily as he spotted the dirt in Qin Ping'an's hand, then continued in a menacing fashion, then you're going to be buried in the dirt before long. Didn't I just say I could do without the 5 copper coins? Is that not accepting a minor loss? Qin Ping'an retorted. The gatekeeper was rather disgruntled by that irrefutable argument, and he waved a dismissive hand to chase Qin Ping'an away. Piss off. Talking to you is like talking to a damn wall. Qin Ping'an released the handful of dirt, then stood up as he said, tree stumps are really damp. You're going to get rheumatism from sitting on that thing. The gatekeeper raised his head as he scoffed, I don't need you to teach me where to sit. I'm a healthy and hot-blooded young man. You could even cook a pancake on my ass. The gatekeeper took a glance at the departing Qin Ping'an out of the corner of his eye, then pursed his lips as he mumbled something, seemingly cursing the heavens. For some reason, Mr. Qi from the private school concluded the lessons early on this day, something that he almost never did. Behind the private school was a yard, to the north of which was a small door constructed from firewood, and it opened up to the bamboo forest outside. While Song Jisin was listening to stories under the old locust tree with Zhuhou, he was called by someone to go and play Go with them. Song Jisin was rather reluctant, but the person who extended the invitation told him that he was there on Mr. Chi's behalf, and that Mr. Chi wanted to see if he had made any improvement in his play. Song Jisin harbored a mixture of indescribable emotions toward the serious and authoritative Mr. Chi. It was a combination of respect and fear. Hence, he had no choice but to accept the invitation, given that it was from Mr. Chi. However, he insisted on staying to hear the end of the story before going to the private school. Thus, the azure-robed young boy who had acted as Mr. Chi's messenger could only return first. Prior to his departure, he urged Song Jisin not to be too late, nagging him with the same old spiel about how Mr. Chi was a man of rules and principles, and that he didn't like it when people were tardy and lacking in punctuality. Song Jisin merely picked at his own ear in an agitated manner, saying something to placate the young boy so that he would go away. As Song Jisin arrived in the yard behind the private school, there was a cool breeze, and as usual, the scholarly azure-robed young boy was already seated on the stool to the south with a serious expression and his back ramrod straight. Song Jisin sat down across from the azure-robed young boy, facing the south, while Mr. Chi was seated over in the west, watching the Go board in silence. Whenever her young master played Go with the azure-robed young boy, Zhuhou would always go to take a stroll in the bamboo forest so that she didn't disturb them, and this day was no exception. There were no highly educated clans in this secluded little town, so scholars were exceedingly rare here. According to the rules set by Mr. Chi, Song Jisin and the azure-robed young boy had to play a minigame of guessing the stones, and the one who received the black stones would get to go first. Song Jisin and the young boy across from him had begun learning Go almost at the same time, but Song Jisin possessed remarkable aptitude and intelligence that allowed him to make rapid progress. Hence, Mr. Chi, who had taught Go to both of them, regarded him as a Go player with extremely high potential. To start off the stone-guessing minigame, Song Jisin would pull out a handful of white stones of indeterminate number from the box. The azure-robed young boy would then pull out either 1 or 2 black stones, and if he could guess whether the number of white stones in Song Jisin's hand was odd or even, then he would receive the black stones and go first, thereby giving him an advantage. In all of the games that they had played against each other in the first 2 years, Song Jisun had maintained a spotless win record regardless of whether he received the black or white stones. However, Song Jisun didn't have much interest in Go, and he was always slacking off in his learning of the game. In contrast, the azure-robed young boy's aptitude was inferior to his, but not only was he a student at the private school, he also served as Mr. Chi's scholarly attendant, so he was always with the teacher. Thus, he was able to learn extensively just from watching Mr. Chi play out games recorded in Go manuals on his own. Hence, with the black stones, the young boy was now able to occasionally win some games. At the moment, with the black stones, he had a roughly 50:50 chance of beating Song Jisun, and his improvement over the years was very apparent. However, Mr. Chi had never commented on the dwindling skill gap between them, and he was always watching their games in silence. Song Jisun was just about to grab some stones when Mr. Chi suddenly said, "Play an even game today. White goes first." The two boys were both quite befuddled, with neither of them having any idea what an even game was supposed to be. Mr. Chi carefully explained the rules in an unhurried manner, and it wasn't very complicated. All that an even game entailed was placing down 2 black and white stones each on the 4 star points of the board. His motions in picking up and placing the stones were extremely fluid and well-rehearsed, presenting an elegant sight to behold. The azure-robed young boy always liked to abide by the rules, so this sudden change was nothing short of a nightmare for him. He stared at the board with a dazed expression, then said in a careful voice, "Mr. Chi, if we play like this, then there are many sets of joziki that we won't be able to use." Song Jisun considered the new rules with slightly furrowed brows for a moment, following which his eyes quickly lit up as he said, "This is essentially shrinking the board." He then looked up with a smile as if he were searching for praise and asked, "Isn't that right, Mr. Chi?" "That is indeed the case," Mr. Chi replied with a nod. Song Jisun raised an eyebrow as he glanced at the boy seated across from him, then chuckled. "Should I give him a handicap of a few stones? Otherwise, he's losing this game for sure." The young boy immediately became flushed with embarrassment upon hearing this. He knew in his heart that the reason he was able to improve his winning record against Song Jisun was not just attributable to his own improvement. Instead, the main reason was because Song Jisun had become less and less interested in the game over the past couple of years, to the point that he was beginning to hate the game. There were many instances in which he had intentionally thrown games or taken major risks in the middle game after he had already secured a clear advantage in the early game, trying to secure flashy wins, only to lose the games in the process. Despite his superb aptitude, Song Jisun's top priority in playing Go had always been to have fun. In contrast, from the moment the azure-robed young boy first picked up a Go stone, he had always been fixated on the concepts of winning and losing. Mr. Chi turned to his scholarly assistant and said, "You can go first with white." During the game, the azure-robed young boy played each turn slowly and carefully, steadily building a foundation, while Song Jisun was playing just as rapidly as usual, going for large and expansive positions. The difference in their personalities was night and day. After only fewer than 90 turns, the azure-robed young boy suffered a catastrophic loss, and he lowered his head in silence with his lips tightly pursed. Song Jisun's elbow was resting on the table, while his cheek was resting on his hand. At the same time, he held a stone between 2 of his fingers on his other hand, gently tapping the stone table as he stared at the position. According to the rules set by Mr. Chi, it was strictly prohibited to verbally declare one's loss, and resignation took place in the form of the silent gesture of tossing one's stones onto the table. The azure-robed young boy was extremely reluctant to admit defeat, but he still resigned. Go and practice your calligraphy. There's no need to clean up the board. Write out the character 300 times. The young boy hurriedly rose to his feet and extended a respectful bow before taking his leave. Only after the young boy was out of sight did Song Jisun ask in a quiet voice, "Are you about to leave this place as well, sir?" The scholar nodded in response. "I will be leaving within 10 days. Song Jisun smiled as he said, "That's good. I'll be able to see you off." The scholar hesitated momentarily, then said, "There's no need to do that. After you leave the town, Make sure to keep a low profile and not draw attention to yourself. I don't have anything other than 3 elementary books, namely Principles of Life for Children, Rights and Music, and an anthology of literary essays. You can take them all. Make sure to revise them regularly. Only by repeatedly reading a book over and over again will you be able to glean its true meaning. If you can read over 10,000 books, you'll be able to write as if you were assisted by the gods. You'll understand what that means when you get to that point. As for those 3 light readings, Profound and Subtle, Tao Li Anthology, and Tales of Mountains and Seas, I encourage you to read them in your free time as well for self-cultivation. A surprised and slightly awkward look appeared on Song Jisun's face, and he mustered up some courage as he said, "It almost sounds like this is going to be the final time we see each other, and it feels very strange." A smile appeared on Mr. Chi's face as he said in a gentle voice, "It's not as serious as you make it out to be. Who knows where we'll meet again someday? I'm sure we'll be reunited eventually." The smile on his face made the beholder feel as if they were basking in a warm spring breeze, and he suddenly said, "Go and pay Zhao Yao a visit. It'll be an early farewell." Song Jisun rose to his feet as he chuckled, "All right, then I'll have to trouble you to clean up the board, sir." He then rushed away gleefully while Mr. Chi bent over to pick up the stones, seemingly in a completely haphazard fashion, but in reality, he was picking the stone up in an alternating sequence of black and white. The first stone that he picked up was the last black stone that Song Jisun had placed, and he cleared the board in the reverse order of the sequence of moves that were played, doing so with unerring accuracy. At some point, Jigui had already returned from the bamboo forest, but she was standing outside the wooden door, refraining from stepping into the yard. Without turning around, Mr. Chi said in a solemn voice, "You're on your own now." At this moment, Jigui wore a dazed and timid look on her face, striking the beholder with a sense of sympathy. A hint of anger appeared on Mr. Chi's face, and he slowly turned away with a cold look in his eyes. Meanwhile, Jigui was still seemingly dazed and confused, as innocent and naive as ever. Mr. Chi stood up straight like a sturdy tree in the wind, turning to the young girl with a cold sneer. "What a disgusting creature you are." The innocent look on the young girl's face slowly faded, and a cold look appeared in her eyes while a mocking sneer surfaced on her face, as if she were asking, "What are you gonna do about it?" The 2 of them stared directly at one another, and it was as if a confrontation between a dragon and a serpent were taking place. Each of them was looking at the other as if they were sworn enemies. In the distance, Song Jisun called out, "Time to go home, Jigui." "Yes, young master," Jigui immediately replied obediently as she got up on the tips of her toes. She pushed the wooden door open, then jogged past Mr. Chi. After running a few steps, she turned around and extended a curtsy toward him as she said in a gentle and adorable voice, "I'll be leaving now, sir." Sometime later, the scholar heaved a faint sigh. The spring breeze was as gentle as ever, and the rustling of the bamboo leaves resembled the sound of a book's turning pages. The young Taoist priest in the lotus hat was packing up his stall while sighing in dismay. The town residents who were familiar with him asked him why he was so glum, but he merely shook his head and refused to answer. A newlywed woman who had last had her fortune told there was passing by, and she could see that the young Taoist priest wasn't his normal self. She stopped in her tracks in a shy manner and began asking questions in a tender voice, but her large, watery eyes were saying something else entirely as they roamed insistently over the young man's handsome face. The Taoist priest took a subtle glance at the woman, but as he shifted his gaze slightly downward, he was greeted by the sight of a voluptuous bulge. He gulped slightly, then said in a mysterious voice, "I picked out a stick for myself earlier today, and it was a bad stick that entails great peril." There was a well in Apricot Blossom Alley by the name of Ironlock Well. A metal chain that was as thick as a young man's arm was dangling down inside the well, and no one knew why the chain was there, nor who had done something as strange and pointless as hanging a chain in the well. Even the oldest individuals in the town were unable to provide any accounts. It was said that there was once a curious individual in the town who wanted to examine just how long the chain was. The old people in the town warned them that those who tried to pull the chain out of the well would have 1 year shaved off their lifespan with each foot of the chain that was pulled, but the man paid no heed to the ominous warning. After tugging vigorously on the chain for 15 minutes, a huge pile of it had been pulled out, but there was still no end in sight. At that point, the man was already completely exhausted, and he left the pile of chain next to the well winch, proclaiming that he was going to be back the next day, and that he was determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. However, on the very same day after he returned home, he died on his bed, bleeding out of all of his orifices, and he refused to close his eyes in death. No matter what his family members tried, they were unable to get his corpse to close its eyes. In the end, an old man whose family had lived near the well for generations instructed that family to carry the corpse over to the well so that it could watch the old man return the chain back into the well. Finally, after the entire chain had sunk down into the depths, the body finally closed its eyes. An old man and a small child were slowly making their way toward the iron lock well. The child was still very young, with 2 lines of snot trailing out of his nostrils, but he could tell a very coherent and organized story, completely unlike the average rural child who had only been attending school for half a year. At this moment, the child was looking up with a pair of large eyes that resembled black grapes, and with a gentle sniffle, the 2 lines of snot retreated back into his nostrils. The child was looking at the storyteller who was carrying the large white bowl, and he said, "That's the end of my story. You're going to show me what's in your bowl now, right? Don't be in such a hurry. Let me take a seat on the edge of the well, and I'll let you look as much as you want." The old man chuckled. The child quickly issued a threat that was disguised as a friendly warning. "You can't break your promise. Otherwise, you'll die a terrible death. As soon as you reach the iron lock well, you'll immediately fall in headfirst, and I'm not fishing up your dead body. If that doesn't happen, then a bolt of lightning will suddenly fall from the sky and zap you into a piece of charcoal. After that, I'll pick up a rock and smash your charred remains to pieces." The old man was beginning to develop a headache as he listened to all of the vicious curses being directed at him by the child, and he hurriedly reassured, "I'll definitely let you look." "Who did you learn to speak like that from?" "My mother," the child replied in a categorical manner. "Your mother must truly be an extremely fine and compassionate woman," the old man praised. The child suddenly stopped in his tracks, and his brows furrowed slightly as he asked, "You're insulting her, aren't you? I know some people like to say good things about others when they mean the exact opposite, like Song Ji-sun." The old man hurriedly denied the accusation, then changed the subject as he asked, "Are there often some strange things happening in this town?" The child nodded in response. "Tell me about it," the old man prompted. The child pointed at the old man with a serious expression as he said, "There's a strange old man who goes around carrying a large white bowl, but doesn't let anyone put money into it. Even before you finished your story, my mother said that you were spinning a very confusing tale, and that you're clearly a serial fraud who makes a living off deceiving others, and that's why you were so insistent on refusing the copper coins that I tried to give you. Now show me what's in that bowl." The old man was completely dumbfounded. As it turned out, the storyteller under the old locust tree from before had asked this child to take him to Apricot Blossom Alley to see the well there. Initially, the child was unwilling to oblige, so the old man told him that his big white bowl was very special, and it was holding something extremely rare and extraordinary. The child had always been very energetic and adventurous from birth. The analogy made by his parents was that it was as if he were missing a bottom, so he didn't know how to sit down. From a very young age, he was always wandering around aimlessly with the delinquents led by Lu Xianying. But what was quite remarkable about him was that he also had the patience to sit completely motionlessly under the scorching sun for an hour just to fish up an eel or a catfish, displaying incredible patience for someone his age. Hence, when the old man proclaimed that there was something extraordinary in his bowl, the child immediately took the bait. The old man had started off by stating that he wanted to try and lift the child to see how heavy he was and gauge whether he weighed over 20 kilograms. Despite the strange nature of the request, the child agreed without any hesitation. In his mind, It wasn't like he was going to lose anything just from being lifted. However, much to the child's dismay and exasperation, the old man held his bowl over his left palm and tried to lift the child with all his might using his right arm 5 or 6 times in a row, only to fail every single time. The child glanced disdainfully at the old man's thin arms and legs, and he shook his head as he thought about how Chen Ping'an was far stronger than the old man, even though they had roughly the same build. However, the child was very smart, and he knew that if he wanted to see what was in the bowl, then he would have to remain in the old man's good graces, so he held back the urge to insult him. In the Clay Vase Alley and Apricot Blossom Alley area, the child could arguably rank third when it came to winning verbal altercations on the street and delivering potent insults, while Song Jisun ranked second, and the child's mother reigned supreme at the top. The old man made his way over to the well, but he didn't sit down on its edge. The well was constructed from clay bricks, and for some reason, the old man's breathing was beginning to grow heavier. The child also approached the well before jumping backward with his back facing it, and his bottom landed perfectly on the well's edge as he took a seat. The old man was terrified to see this. If the child had made even a slight misjudgment, he would have fallen into the well, and given the stories and stigma that surrounded the well, it would most likely be very difficult to even find anyone willing to fish his body up from the bottom. The old man slowly took a few steps forward, leaning down to inspect the metal chain, one end of which was bound tightly to the underside of the well winch. I wonder whose possession this prized artifact will ultimately end up in, the old man thought to himself with a myriad of emotions in his heart. He reached out his spare left hand and stared at the palm. There was a complex system of lines on his palm, but there was a brand new line that was slowly elongating, much like a lengthening crack on a piece of porcelain. For deities, observing their own palm was like observing an entire world, but for the old man, he was only looking at himself. His brows furrowed tightly as he exclaimed, "If things are already this terrible after just half a day, then what's become of them?" The child had already stood up on the edge of the well, and he had one hand on his hip while pointing at the old man with his other hand as he urged loudly, "Are you going to show me your white bowl or not? Hurry up and get down from there." "I'll show you my bowl now," the old man said in an exasperated manner. The child was feeling rather skeptical, but he still jumped down from the edge of the well. The old man hesitated momentarily, following which a solemn look appeared on his face. "It seems we were fated to meet, so it's not out of the question for me to show you what this bowl can do. However, after you see it, you can't tell anyone else about it, not even your mother. If you can do that, then I'll show you. If you can't, then no matter how much you prod or insult me, I won't let you take even a single peek." The child nodded in response. "I can do that. Show me." The old man made his way over to the well with a serious expression, and he looked down to find that the child was squatting on the edge of the well this time, and he was beginning to regret picking out this unruly child as his guide. The old man banished those trivial thoughts from his mind, then grabbed onto the underside of his bowl with all 5 fingers of his right hand as he faced the well. His palm then began to tilt ever so slightly to a degree that was barely detectable. The child felt as if he had already been waiting for a very long time, but no change took place in the bowl above his head, and the old man's posture also remained unchanged. Right as the lines of snot flowing out of the child's nostrils were about to reach his lips, and he was about to run out of patience, a stream of water that was as thick as a finger poured out of the bowl before silently flowing into the well. The child was furious, and he was just about to erupt into an angry tirade when he abruptly shut his mouth in surprise at what he was seeing. A short while later, the expression on his face had already turned from astonishment to confusion, and after that, a fearful look began to appear in his eyes. All of a sudden, he snapped back to his senses and jumped down from the edge of the well before fleeing toward his home. As it turned out, the amount of water that the old man had poured into the well out of his white bowl had already far exceeded the capacity of a large water vat, but there was still more water constantly pouring out of the bowl, and the child was convinced that he had seen a ghost. Lu Xinying casually snapped a branch that had only just sprouted out of a tree that he was passing by, and he began to use it for sword practice. He was spinning around in circles like a wheel gone mad, raising up a massive dust cloud and making no effort to look after the pair of new boots that he was wearing. After emerging from the town, he made his way southward. After crossing the covered bridge funded by Master Song and walking about 1 to 2 more kilometers, he would arrive at the blacksmith forge run by Master Wan and his daughter. Lu Xianyang had always been extremely arrogant and unruly, but it had only taken a single sentence for Master Wan to earn his complete and utter admiration. "We came here solely to forge swords." Lu Xianyang couldn't help but get excited at just the mere thought of being able to own a real sword in the future, and he tossed the branch aside before breaking into a sprint while yelling in excitement. Lu Xianyang thought back to the handful of fist techniques that Master Wan had taught him in private, and he started to practice them, looking very much like he was cut out for the part. He was getting closer and closer to the covered bridge, and there were 4 people seated on the steps on the northern end of the bridge. One of those was a beautiful and voluptuous woman who was holding a boy in a big red robe in her arms. His chin was raised up high as if he were a general that had just returned from a comprehensive victory in battle, while on the other side of the steps was an imposing old man with a head of white hair. The old man was in the process of consoling an angry little girl whose skin was so fair and delicate that it was as if she were the most intricately crafted porcelain doll in this world. Her delicate skin was glittering and translucent under the sun, to the point that one could even clearly see a series of fine veins under her skin. The 2 children had just had a verbal altercation, and the little girl was on the verge of tears, while the little boy was only looking more and more triumphant. The old man was built like a small mountain, and the woman beside him gave him an apologetic look, only to be completely ignored. There was also a young man with the Lu surname standing at the foot of the steps. He was the eldest grandson of the Lu clan's leader, and his name was Lu Zhengzhen. Perhaps the earth and water in certain places really did nurture the people there better than in other places. The local residents of the town were generally better looking than the people outside of the town. However, Lu Zhengzhen had already completely ruined his own body through alcohol abuse and excessive sexual activity, presenting him as a very unsightly young man to the 4 people sitting on the steps. The Lu clan owned the most dragon kills out of any clan in the town, and their dragon kills were also of the best quality. It was also the clan that produced the most descendants that left the town to settle elsewhere. Lu Zhengzhen was normally always strutting around the town as if he owned the place, but at this moment, his complexion was very pale, and he was wearing a reserved and humble expression. His entire body was also extremely tensed up, as if the slightest misstep here would lead to the execution of his entire clan. The boy was speaking in a language that was foreign to the town's residents as he said, "Mother, is the ancestor of that little worm with the Lu surname really?" He was just about to state a name when the woman hurriedly clasped a hand over his mouth. "Don't refer to people directly by their names unless it's necessary. Your father told you that many times before we came here." The boy pried the woman's hand aside with an excited look in his eyes as he lowered his voice and asked, "Has his clan really been passing down the prized armor and sword scripture for generations?" The woman stroked his head with a doting expression as she said in a gentle voice, "The Lu clan swore on half of their genealogy tree that those 2 things are still hidden in his home." The boy suddenly began to behave like a spoiled child as he urged, "Mother, mother, can we trade treasures with them? The suit of prized armor that we're trying to obtain is hideous. Think about it, mother. If we can get our hands on that sword scripture instead, we'll be able to decapitate people with flying swords. That's way more badass than an ugly turtle shell." Before the woman had a chance to offer an explanation to the boy, the little girl next to them had already erupted into a fit of fury. "How dare you even think about trying to take the most prized treasure of our mountain? We came here to take back something that rightfully belongs to us. We're not completely shameless like you. You're a bandit, a thief, a beggar, even." The boy turned to her and made a mocking face, then sneered, "You said it yourself just now, you dumb lass. It's the most prized treasure of your mountain, which doesn't mean anything in my eyes." The boy suddenly stood up from the woman's lap, then looked down at the little girl with a sympathetic expression as he preached to her like a school teacher scolding a student. The pursuit of the Great Tao is an endeavor that pits one against the natural order, so we must strive to secure every possible resource to help us on this journey. If you don't even understand such a simple concept, then how are you going to inherit your clan and uphold the teachings of your ancestors? Once every 30 years, the descendants of your son Scorch Mountain must elevate the mountain by at least 1,000 feet. Do you think that was an easy task for your father and your grandfather? The little girl was stumped by the boy's words, and she lowered her head with a defeated expression, not daring to look at him. The white-haired old man said in a serious voice, "I understand that we shouldn't take offense to the words of children, but if our young mistress Dowhart is tarnished by that boy's words, then you'll have to bear the consequences." The woman gave an apologetic smile, then put on a stern expression as she tugged the boy back into her arms before giving a barbed response. "This is just an argument between children. There's no need to take it so seriously, Senior Yuan. Our two clans have been on friendly terms for over 1,000 years. It would be a complete travesty if that relationship were to be spoiled by such a trivial matter." However, the old man had an extremely unyielding personality, and he retorted, "Our son Scorch Mountain has been around for 2,600 years, and we've always repaid those who have treated us with kindness, but similarly, we've never spared anyone who's dared to wrong us." The woman merely smiled in response and didn't argue any further. Both of them had important tasks to complete on this trip to the small town. In particular, she was taking an extremely extravagant gamble, putting her own life, the future of her son, and everything in her parental family's possession on the line. Even though the woman was dressed in very simple and unadorned attire, she was very graceful and elegant, but the uneducated residents of the town were oblivious to her refined disposition. This entire time, Lu Zhengzhen stood with his back facing the steps of the covered bridge. He could still recall the first time that he had seen these esteemed guests in the Lu Manor. His younger brother was lacking in discipline and was unable to suppress his primal urges, leading him to forget their grandfather's warnings. He couldn't help but sneak a glance at the woman's chest, and their grandfather had instantly flown into such a violent rage that his entire body was trembling with fury. He immediately ordered for the young man to be dragged out into the yard and flogged to death. It seemed that while the flogging was taking place, his mouth had been stuffed full of cotton, so Lu Zhengzhen didn't hear the agonized howls of his brother, nor did he witness the gruesome scene of his execution. Following the conclusion of their meeting with those esteemed guests, Lu Zhengzhen stepped out of the room to find that all of the blood in the courtyard had already been cleaned up, and the four guests, even the pair of children, displayed no reaction to this, as if this were something completely ordinary and to be expected. In that instant, Lu Zhengzhen felt as if he were in a dream. A living person from their family had just been killed, yet it was being played off as if nothing more than a stray dog had just been executed. Just the night before, the two brothers had been drinking together, and Lu Zhengzhen's younger brother had been extremely motivated and brimming with excitement, declaring that he was definitely going to become successful and bring honor to the clan, that the two of them were going to work together and make something out of themselves rather than spending their entire lives in the confines of the Lu Manor. Even after making his way out of the Lu Manor, Lu Zhengzhen's mind was still completely blank. From that incident, the seed of fear was planted into his heart. Whenever any of those esteemed guests asked him anything, his voice would tremble when he answered, and whenever he took them anywhere, his legs would quiver. He knew that he was putting on an extremely embarrassing display and bringing shame upon his grandfather and his entire clan, but he was simply unable to control his own fear. In their presence, he felt as if his entire body were constantly submerged in a glacial pit. At the end of the previous year, his grandfather had taken him and his brother into a secret chamber and informed them that the Lu clan was about to be tasked with doing something for a certain group of extremely important people. He told them that this was an enormous blessing and that they had to exercise the utmost caution when serving these people. If they could complete the assigned tasks successfully, then the Lu clan would dedicate the entirety of the compensation that they received from those people to nurturing and developing the two brothers. All it would take would be a nod from those eminent figures, and a path leading straight to unimaginable heights would be paved beneath their feet, and they would be blessed with unfathomable wealth and glory. It was only then that he finally understood why he and his brother had been forced to learn so many types of strange dialects from a young age. Lu Zhongzhen watched as Lu Xianying drew closer and closer to the covered bridge, and a sense of fierce resentment suddenly welled up in his heart. Lu Xianying was nothing more than a piece of low-class scum that had once almost been beaten to death like a stray dog by him and his lackeys. If it weren't for that meddling little bastard who had run out onto the street and called for help, he and his lackeys were already preparing to enact the punishment that they had agreed upon in advance, taking off their pants to give the arrogant young man a warm shower. Even now, Lu Zhongzhen still couldn't understand why these high and mighty individuals had taken such a liking to Lu Xianying. As for certain things that they mentioned like prized armor, sword scripture, sun-scorched mountain, the great Tao to immortality, and fighting over resources and opportunities, Lu Zhongzhen could understand everything, but at the same time, he had no idea what they were talking about. However, there was one thing that Lu Zhongzhen knew for certain, which was that he wanted nothing more than to see Lu Xianying die here. As for the true reason for his scorching resentment toward Lu Xianying, he didn't dare to admit it to himself, nor did he dare to ponder the subject. Deep down in his heart, Lu Zhongzhen would almost rather die than allow a piece of lowly scum like Lu Xianying to see him, an esteemed young master of the Lu clan, acting like an obedient dog in front of others. This was just about the most humiliating thing that he could think of. Upon spotting Lu Xianying, the woman murmured, "He's here." Lu Xianying was still practicing his fist techniques on the way to the bridge, and with each punch that he threw, he was doing so with increasing speed and power, to the point that he was stumbling around a little from the force that he was exerting. Even though his techniques were still very rudimentary and unpolished, in the eyes of an expert, he was already displaying a knack for combining strength with subtlety, a trait that was only seen in masters. In the art of the fist, there was a fundamental mantra, which stated that those who didn't know the true meaning of the fist could train for a century and still be a novice, while those who grasped the true meaning of the fist could strike down even demons and gods. The woman was very relieved. As expected, Lu Xianying was the person that they were looking for, and he did indeed possess remarkable aptitude. Even in immortal clans like theirs, his aptitude for cultivation was nothing to be scoffed at. Of course, in the vast world that the woman and the old man were part of, there was also no lack of prodigal cultivation talents of Lu Xianying's caliber. The woman rose to her feet, then turned to Lu Zhongzhen as she instructed, "Go and ask that young man what we would need to give him in exchange for the suit of armor and the scripture that have been passed down in his clan for generations." Lu Zhongzhen turned around and extended a respectful bow, replying in that dialect that was completely unintelligible to the town's residents, "Yes, mistress." "Make sure to speak to that young man with respect, and take care not to offend him," the woman added. The boy also pointed a finger at Lu Zhongzhen, regarding him like a servant as he warned, "If you screw this up, I'll skin you and pull out all of your tendons, then turn your soul into a flame to light a torch. Until that torch goes out, you'll constantly be in so much agony that you'll wish you were dead." Lu Zhongzhen shuddered in horror upon hearing this, and he bowed even deeper as he hurriedly replied in a fearful voice, "I'll be sure to convince him." The little girl finally saw an opportunity to strike back at her tormentor, and she sneered, "You sure like to act tough in front of mere mortals. On the way here, you were called a vandal and a bastard by other cultivators, and you didn't even dare to strike back." The old man already had an extremely low opinion of the mother and son pair, and he added, "I'm afraid you're mistaken, young mistress." He wasn't too afraid to strike back, he was too afraid to talk back to them. The boy gritted his teeth tightly as he glowered at the girl with a sinister expression, but he didn't issue a retort. Instead, he suddenly put on a vibrant smile, as if he were completely unfazed by her mockery. Meanwhile, the woman's gaze remained fixed on the path up ahead, and there was a tranquil and placid look on her face. As for whether she had taken what was said to heart, that was something that only she knew. The little girl gave a cold harumph, then ran down the steps and squatted down beside the creek to watch the fish swimming in the water. Occasionally, there were schools of different numbers of red and green carp swimming past under her watchful gaze. While chatting under the old locust tree, some of the older individuals in the town often mentioned that when passing over the covered bridge during lightning storms, they had all previously seen a golden carp swimming past. However, some of them claimed that the golden carp was only around the same length as a human hand, while others proclaimed that the carp was enormous, half the length of a grown man at the very least, as if it were evolving into a higher life form. The old people in the town were constantly arguing over who had the correct details in their story, and due to the conflicting accounts, none of the children were willing to believe that such a creature truly existed. The water in the creek was so clear that one could see all the way to the bottom, and at this moment, the little girl was staring intently into the water with her cheeks resting on her hands. The old man crouched down beside her as he chuckled, "Young mistress, if the leader of the Lu clan wasn't lying to us, then that creature has already fallen into someone else's hands." The little girl turned to the old man with a grin as she countered, "Perhaps there's more than one of them, Grandpa Yuan." In doing so, she revealed the comical gap where one of her front teeth was missing, and she immediately realized this as she hurriedly clapped a hand over her own mouth. The old man resisted the urge to laugh as he explained, "Before flood dragons make their way into rivers, they are extremely territorial and strictly prohibit their own kind from getting near them. Hence." The little girl gave a half-hearted response, then turned back around to continue staring into the water with her cheeks resting in her hands, and she murmured to herself, "But what if there's a chance?" For the first time, a stern and authoritative look appeared on the benevolent old man's face, and he gently laid a hand onto the little girl's head as he said in a solemn voice, "Young mistress, you must remember at all times that relying on luck and chance is a sure path to an early demise, and such a way of thinking cannot be allowed to take root in your mind. You are far too precious." The little girl pulled out a hand from under her cheek and waved it around vigorously as she grumbled in a disgruntled voice, I know. I've heard this so many times that my ears are about to grow calluses. I'm going back to keep an eye on the proceedings, young mistress." On the surface, they're supposed to be allies of our sun-scorched mountain, but when it comes to their integrity and the way they conduct themselves, I won't mention it. It's not worth soiling your precious ears hearing about them. The little girl waved a hand to dismiss the old man, and he could only depart with a resigned expression. The old man appeared to be a servant of hers, and his back was slightly hunched over as he walked, while his hands trailed all the way down to his knees, as if he were carrying a heavy burden on his back. All of a sudden, the little girl rubbed her own eyes in surprise. The reason for her surprise was that the water level in the creek was slowly rising at a rate that was discernible to the naked eye. If they weren't in this small town, then she wouldn't have been surprised at all by this. For example, if they were on sun-scorched mountain or anywhere in their home region, then she wouldn't have batted an eyelid even if an entire creek had dried up in the blink of an eye. The little girl was rather perplexed as she murmured to herself, "Aren't all profound arts, mystical abilities, and powers naturally restricted here? And isn't it the case that the more advanced one's cultivation base is, the more backlash they suffer here? Grandpa Yuan told me that even that legendary figure has found himself in a severely weakened state after staying here for so long, so he won't be able to stop us from fighting over the prized artifacts." In the end, she shook her head to rid herself of that train of thought, no longer interested in pondering the matter. She turned to look at the old man's imposing figure, and she gleefully thought to himself that once the restrictions here were completely lifted, she would ask him to carry that mountain by the name of Cloud Drape Mountain back home with them so that she could make it her own flower garden. Ever since he returned home, Jinpingen's eyelid had been constantly twitching. It was said that the twitching of the left eyelid signified wealth, while the twitching of the right eyelid entailed disaster. He sat down onto the doorstep and began to visualize pottery molding with his hands suspended in midair, quickly entering a completely immersive state. His commendable work ethic was one reason why he always kept up with this type of visualization practice, while another very important factor was that the activity helped him stave off hunger. Hence, he had developed the habit of performing this type of practice whenever there was something on his mind. The craft of pottery firing was one that depended greatly on the will of the heavens. Prior to uncovering a piece of chinaware, no one knew whether its form, coloration, and glaze would be up to standard, and one could only take what they were given by the gods. However, prior to firing a piece of pottery, The molding process was undoubtedly extremely important. Unfortunately, Qin Ping'an had always been deemed by Old Man Yao to be lacking in aptitude and was mostly assigned manual labor tasks like pugging. Thus, he could only watch from the side and practice molding on his own to try and develop a feel for the process. The sound of the neighboring yard's wooden gate being opened rang out, signaling the return of Song Jisun and Ji Gue from the school. Song Jisun lunged forward and jumped onto the wall with ease, then squatted down before spreading his hands open, releasing a bunch of fingernail-sized rocks of different colors, including white, green, and red. These completely valueless rocks of different sizes were extremely commonplace all throughout the bank of the creek in the town, and among them, the most sought-after one was a type of bright red rock that looked as if it had been soaked in chicken blood. Mr. Qi had carved a seal out of one such rock for his disciple, Zhao Yao, and Song Jisun had taken a liking to it, offering to exchange it for something on several occasions, but he was resolutely turned down every time. Song Jisun tossed a rock lightly through the air, and it struck Qin Ping'an on the chest, but he remained completely unmoved. The next rock struck him on the forehead, but he still displayed no reaction. Song Jisun was already accustomed to this, and he threw a collection of 7 or 8 rocks one after another. Even though Song Jisun was trying to distract Qin Ping'an from his visualization training with these rocks, he refrained from directly hitting Qin Ping'an's arms and fingers as he felt like that would be going too far. After tossing all of his rocks, Song Jisun clapped his hands together, while Qin Ping'an exhaled and shook out his wrists, completely ignoring Song Jisun. Following a brief pause, he lowered his head and curled the fingers on his left hand as if he were gripping onto an invisible burin. The skill of the jumping burin wasn't a skill that was unique to any of the old potters in the town, but anyone who saw Old Man Yao's jumping burin technique would always be full of praise and admiration. Old Man Yao had taken several disciples, but none of them truly lived up to his standards. Only after finding Lu Xianyang did he finally feel like he had found someone worthy of inheriting his skills. In the past, whenever Lu Xianyang practiced the jumping burin technique, Qin Ping'an would always watch intently from the side as long as he wasn't preoccupied with some other task. Lu Xianyang really liked to show off, and he knew that Qin Ping'an was very good at keeping secrets, so he often revealed pieces of Old Man Yao's secret mantras to Qin Ping'an to flaunt his knowledge. For example, in order to ensure the burin followed a stable path, one couldn't focus dogmatically on keeping one's hand steady. Ultimately, the key was to keep one's heart steady. However, when Qin Ping'an asked him what keeping one's heart steady meant, Lu Xianyang had no answer. After watching for a while longer, Song Jisun grew bored and jumped down from the wall before entering the room. Ji Gue was standing beside the wall, and without getting up on the tips of her toes, only half of her face was peeking out over the top of the wall. Even so, it was still possible to tell that she was going to grow up into a splendid beauty. After a moment of hesitation, she gently got up on the tips of her toes and swept her gaze over the area around Qin Ping'an before catching sight of a pair of rocks that caught her fancy. One of them was translucent and bright red, while the other one was as white as snow, and both of them had just been tossed away by Song Jisun just now. After another brief hesitation, she called out in a timid voice, "Qin Ping'an, can you pick up those 2 rocks for me? I really like them." Qin Ping'an raised his head to look at her, indicating with his eyes for her to wait for a moment, but he didn't stop what he was doing, and his hands remained as stable as ever. Ji Gue gave a warm smile in response, presenting a stunning sight to behold, like the first green buds sprouting out of a tree branch in early spring. However, Qin Ping'an had already lowered his head, so he missed out on the beautiful scenery. The corners of her lips perked up slightly, and a hint of light surged through her eyes as if there were some type of tiny living creature swimming within them. By the time Qin Ping'an finished his visualization practice and asked her which 2 stones she wanted, the look in her eyes had already returned to normal, and she was back to looking as gentle and timid as ever. Qin Ping'an picked up the 2 rocks that she was pointing at, then made his way over to the wall. She had only just raised a hand when Qin Ping'an set the rocks down on top of the wall. She picked up the rocks and held them tightly in her hand. If fate weren't on one side, then they could search for something for years on end without ever finding it, But if it were meant to be, then some things were as easily obtainable as shoddy wares being sold on the side of the street. And it would depend entirely on one's mood whether they wanted to take it or not. Are you not worried about that snotty little kid coming over to give you a piece of his mind? Qin Pingyan chuckled. She didn't admit that her young master had stolen from someone else, but she wasn't shameless enough to deny the truth either, so she merely smiled and remained silent. There was a mother and son pair living on Clay Vase Alley, and they were completely unmatched in the town when it came to their ability to win arguments and deliver vicious insults. Only Song Jisun could compete with them in this regard. Among the pair, the child was particularly egregious. He constantly had 2 lines of snot trailing out of his nostrils, and he liked to catch fish and pick up rocks from the creek. All of the fish that he caught were kept in a large water vat, while the rocks that he collected were piled up next to the vat. For some reason, Song Jisun really liked to pick on the kid. Every once in a while, he would take a few rocks from the boy's collection, and this wasn't so apparent at first, but what was happening quickly became clear over time as Song Jisun was regularly taking rocks from the pile. Whenever the boy noticed that some of the prized rocks were missing, he would fly into a rage like a wild kitten that had just had its tail trodden on, and he could stand outside Song Jisun's yard and yell profanities for 2 hours at a time. His mother never tried to dissuade him from this behavior. Instead, she was always eagerly fanning the flames, specifically bringing up the fact that Song Jisun was an illegitimate son of the previous kiln supervision official. On quite a few occasions, Song Jisun was so enraged by this pair that he had almost carried a bench outside to fight them, and Ji Gui had to hold him back each time. All of a sudden, a high-pitched voice rang out. "Hurry up and come out, Song Jisun. Your maidservant is flirting with Qin Pingyan right as I speak. It's clear that they're hooking up. If you don't come out to discipline your maidservant, there's a good chance she'll jump over the wall tonight and go knocking on Qin Pingyan's door. Come out, come out. Look, Qin Pingyan's stroking her cheek. Oh my goodness, if only you could see the disgusting grin on Qin Pingyan's face." Song Jisun didn't bother to come out, and he yelled in response from inside his house, "What's the big deal? I saw Qin Pingyan groping your mother last night. Only after I ran into them did Qin Pingyan hurriedly pull his hand out of your mother's collar. To be fair, your mother is the one to blame. She's way too full and voluptuous there." Poor Qin Pingyan was sweating buckets because of how heavy those damn things were. Someone on the alley outside began to kick viciously at Song Jisun's gate as they yelled in a furious voice, "Come out and fight me one-on-one, Song Jisun. If you lose, then you have to hand over Ji Gui to become my maidservant. I'll have her feed me, make my bed, and wash my feet every day. If I lose, Qin Pingyan will become your servant. What do you say? Do you dare to accept my challenge? Whoever backs down is a cowardly turtle." Inside the room, Song Jisun retorted in a lazy voice, "Get out of here, Gu Kan. I was flipping the lunar almanac, and it tells me that this is not a good day for a father to beat up his son, so I'll let you off the hook for now, you lucky little bastard." The child continued to pound the gate with all his might. "Ji Gui, aren't you ashamed to be following such a cowardly master? I say you should go and elope with Lu Xianyang. That idiot's always looking at you like he wants to eat you up." Ji Gui turned and returned to the house. Inside, Song Jisun was carefully polishing a bright green gourd. It was an antique from an indeterminate era, and it was one of the things left behind by Master Song. In the beginning, Song Jisun didn't pay much attention to it, but he later discovered that whenever there was a lightning storm, a buzzing sound would ring out from within the gourd. However, after removing the cork, no matter how much he shook or swung the gourd around, nothing would come out. He also tried filling it with water and sand before pouring it out, and the exact same amount of water and sand would come out. Thus, he could only set it aside again. One time, Gu Kan's abhorrent mother was outside his gate, taunting him over and over again about being an illegitimate son who had been abandoned by his father. The insults were really getting to him, and in a fit of rage, he picked up a blade before hacking viciously at the gourd to vent his fury. However, to his astonishment, the edge of the blade had already fully curled back, yet the gourd was still completely unscathed, with not even the slightest mark left on its surface. In a letter that had been burned by Song Jisun some years ago, It was written, "The gold, silver, and copper coins brought to you will ensure that all expenses will be covered for you and Ji Gui." In your spare time, you can search for some antiques that take your fancy for the purpose of developing a tasteful hobby. The town isn't a very big place, but the coarse grains here are enough to nurture the belly. The books can nurture the mind, the scenery can nurture the eyes, and the peace and quiet can nurture the heart. From this day forth, you can only do your best and let fate decide the rest. The dragon lurking in plain sight will be sure to rise to the heavens someday. Even though Song Jisin resented his father, there was no reason for him not to spend the money left to him. In the simple and unsophisticated small town, it was difficult to spend a lot of money even if one wanted to. Over the years, Song Jisin really developed a hobby of collecting all types of trinkets. He had a large red chest that was filled with all types of interesting obscure items like the green gourd, but Song Jisin had a profound and inexplicable feeling that out of all of the items in the chest, of which there were around 3 dozens, the gourd was the most important one, followed by a rusty violet gold bell. When shaken, it could be clearly seen that the clapper of the bell was clattering against its inner wall, so it should have produced a chime, but it was completely silent. This phenomenon both terrified and fascinated Song Jisin. The only other artifact worthy of note was an old teapot with the word "mandrill" inscribed upon it. As for all of the other items, Song Jisin didn't really care much for them. Outside his yard, Gukun was still yelling profanities and insults with indefatigable vigor. However, shortly thereafter, his voice abruptly cut off. The boy then suddenly pushed open the gate of Chenpingen's yard before rushing inside with a panicked expression. After sliding the deadbolt across, he squatted down beside the gate before silently indicating for Chenpingen to also squat down beside him. Chenpingen had no idea what was happening, but he ducked down and rushed over to the boy's side, then squatted down beside him as he asked in a low voice, "What happened, Gukan? Did you get your mother angry again?" Gukun sniffled vigorously as he replied in a quiet voice, "I met a really strange person just now. He could use the white bowl in his hand to keep on pouring out water without stopping. The bowl was only this big, yet I just saw him pouring water out of it nonstop for 2 hours. As he was passing by the entrance of our clay vase alley, he seemed to have stopped. Could it be that he spotted me? I'm in so much trouble." Gukun used his hands to describe to Chenpingen the size of the bowl, then patted his own chest as he panted. He almost frightened Song Jisin's father here to death. "Are you talking about the storyteller under the locust tree?" Chenpingen asked. Gukun nodded eagerly in response. "That's him. The old man doesn't have much strength in his arms, and he can't even lift me up, but that bowl of his is terrifying. Terrifying, I tell you." Gukun suddenly grabbed onto Chenpingen's arm as he vowed, "I'm not lying to you this time, Chenpingen. I swear. If I'm lying to you, then let Song Jisin suffer a terrible death." Chenpingen raised a finger to his lips to make a silencing gesture, and the child immediately fell silent. The sound of footsteps gradually drew closer outside, then faded into the distance. Everyone was scared of something. Prior to this, Gukun seemed to be completely fearless, but at this moment, his face was deathly pale, and he sat down onto the ground as he rubbed his hand haphazardly over his own face. It was clear that he really was terrified of the old man. "You don't think that old bastard went to my house, do you? What should I do?" Gukun suddenly asked. "How about I accompany you back home to take a look?" Chenpingen asked with a resigned expression. This was most likely exactly what Gukun was waiting to hear, and he immediately rose to his feet, only to sit back down again in a deflated manner before turning to Chenpingen with a pitiful expression. "My knees are weak. I can't walk." Chenpingen stood up, then bent over and grabbed onto the back of Gukan's collar, lifting up with one hand as he slid back the deadbolt and made his way out of the courtyard. The child's house was only around 100 meters away from Chenpingen's, and sure enough, upon arriving there, Gukun spotted the old man in their courtyard, and his mother had even pulled out a stool for him to sit on. In that instant, Gukun felt as if the entire sky had fallen onto him, and he cowered behind Chenpingen, hoping that Chenpingen would protect him. Fortunately, Chenpingen rose to the occasion, leading the way while Gukun trailed along behind him. Guken clutched onto Qin Pingin's sleeve, and he was instilled with a surge of courage, seemingly having been emboldened by Qin Pingin's presence. The old man paid no heed to the two young boys as he sat on the stool, seemingly thinking about something, and the white bowl he was holding earlier was nowhere to be seen. All of the courage instantly left Guken's body, and he ducked behind Qin Pingin once again in a fearful manner. The old man took a glance at the remarkably calm woman, then turned his attention toward the wary Qin Pingin before finally settling his gaze on Guken as he asked, "What are you keeping in that water vat over there?" Guken yelled out in response from behind Qin Pingin, "What else could it be? Just some fish, prawns, and crabs that I caught from the creek and some eels and catfish that I fished out of the farm channels. If you like them, you're welcome to take them." His voice was growing quieter and quieter as he spoke, clearly indicating a lack of conviction and courage. The woman smoothed down her own hair momentarily before turning to Qin Pingin as she called out in a gentle voice, "Pingin." Qin Pingin could see what she wanted, and he patted Guken on the head before turning to depart. A hint of guilt surfaced in the woman's eyes as she glanced at Qin Pingin's departing figure, but she quickly banished those thoughts and feelings as she turned to the old man and asked, "You've come a long way to get here, esteemed immortal master. Are you planning to buy this opportunity or take it by force?" The old man smiled as he shook his head in response. "I can't afford the price required to buy this opportunity, nor am I able to take it by force." Perhaps that was true in the past, but it may not continue to hold true in the future, the woman countered with a shake of her head. The casual and relaxed demeanor of the old man instantly faded upon hearing this, and it was as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning. He abruptly swept a sleeve through the air, rapidly moving his fingers as if he were calculating something. He then heaved a long sigh. Was it really necessary to go so far? A cold look appeared on the woman's face as she sneered. "Did you think that this town was full of good people?" The old man rose to his feet and cast a meaningful glance toward the befuddled child, and he seemed to have made an extremely important decision as he produced the white bowl with a flick of his wrist. He then made his way over to the large water vat, which was around half the height of a grown man, and quickly scooped out a bowl of water from within. The woman was putting on a calm and collected facade, but in reality, her palms were sweating profusely. The old man sat back down onto the stool, then beckoned to Guken, "Come here and take a look, child." Guken turned to his mother with an inquisitive expression, and she nodded at him with encouragement in her eyes. Once the boy had reached him, the old man gently blew onto the surface of the water in the bowl, causing it to ripple incessantly. "Open your mouth," the old man instructed with a smile. At the same time, the old man pulled out a locust leaf from somewhere on Guken's body with a casual swipe of his hand. He held the leaf in between two of his fingers in a very light grip. Guken reflexively opened his mouth in surprise upon seeing this, and with a flick of his finger, the bright green locust leaf vanished into Guken's mouth. The boy was instantly rooted to the spot, but he then discovered that nothing seemed to feel different in his mouth. Before he had a chance to say anything, the old man pointed at the bowl sitting on the palm of his hand as he asked, "Take a good look and tell me if you see anything." Guken stared into the bowl with wide eyes, and first, he saw an extremely tiny black spot. The black spot then gradually transformed into a slightly larger black line, and it continued to slowly expand, turning into an earthy yellow catfish that was swimming happily in the rippling water inside the bowl. A spark of recognition abruptly appeared in Guken's muddled mind, and he exclaimed, "I remember that thing. It was Qin Pingin's and I." The woman immediately slapped him across the face with a furious expression. "Shush!" The old man wasn't surprised by this at all, and he said in an indifferent voice, "We cultivate for the sake of immortality, which is already an endeavor that goes against the natural order. So fighting over resources and opportunities to aid us on that path is nothing to be frowned upon. There's no need to be so nervous. What rightfully belongs to your son will come to him no matter what, and what doesn't belong to that young boy will ultimately not fall in his possession." Guken weighed less than 40 kilograms, but his aptitude was incredibly heavy. The old man had gone out of his way earlier to perform a secret technique that had been passed down for generations, one that allowed him to gauge the weight of the cultivation aptitude in others. The fact that he was unable to lift up Gukun while using this secret technique was a testament to the boy's exceptional aptitude, and that was why he was going to accept the boy as his disciple. Otherwise, a child of his age with such a prized entity in his possession would be bringing nothing but disaster upon himself. A carefree smile appeared on the old man's face, but his eyes were as cold as ice as he said, "Of course, even if it did originally belong to that boy, what does it matter? Now that I'm here, it no longer belongs to him." Gukan's teeth began to chatter, and he was suddenly feeling very cold. In contrast, the woman was looking very relieved. The old man put on a kind and benevolent expression once again as he said, "My child, this bowl contains the water of an entire river, and now there's a little flood dragon inside it. From this point onward, you will be a direct disciple to me. I am a true lord, and I'm only half a step away from becoming a sect-founding patriarch, albeit only for a lower sect. In the future, you'll come to understand the significance of concepts like true lords and sect founding. I assure you that those concepts hold more weight than the water of the entire river in this bowl." All of a sudden, Gukun burst into tears. "This isn't right. That thing belongs to Jinpingen." The woman became even more furious, and she raised her hand to discipline her foolish child again, but the old man waved a hand to stop her. He smiled as he said in a nonchalant manner, "It's not necessarily a bad thing that he has such a kind heart." Gukun lowered his head and used the back of his hand to wipe at his tears and snot, while the woman turned to the old man in silence. The old man nodded as he gave her a meaningful smile, and both of them understood one another, so there was no need for further words. Upon raising his head, Gukun discovered that his mother and this master of his that had suddenly popped up out of nowhere both had faint smiles on their faces. Gukun turned around to find that Jinpingen had closed the gate of the yard upon his departure. The town was like a plot of farmland during the harvest season, but some people were like weeds that were interspersed throughout the crops, with no one paying them any attention. The lonesome straw-sandaled young boy making his way through Clay Vase Alley was precisely one of those people. A man and a woman made their way into Clay Vase Alley. The man was quite young with a tall hat on his head and a green jade pendant hanging from his waist, looking even more like a wealthy young master than the young men from the affluent Liu clan. As for the woman, it was difficult to discern her age. At first glance, she had delicate skin and a tapered chin that resembled stalactites hanging down from the edges of roofs during winter, but upon closer inspection, she had the mature charm of a middle-aged woman. Her phoenix eyes, her seductive figure, everything about her from head to toe gave off a sense of unadulterated promiscuity, and her hips twisted from side to side as she walked, giving off a sense of allure that was completely absent in the other women of the town. The woman was looking left and right with curiosity brimming in her eyes, and she even reached out to touch the earthen walls, but was unable to find anything special about them. A curious look appeared on her face as she asked, "Fu Nanhua, is this place really one of the hidden blessed paradises that you were talking about? Why is it that this alley was never specially annotated on the map given to me by our patriarch before I set off on this journey?" The young man gave a response, but not to the questions that he was asked. "How are you going to repay me if you come across an unexpected prize here?" The woman turned to the side, interlacing her fingers as she clasped her hands behind her back, pushing forward and further accentuating her already voluptuous chest as she put on a gentle smile and replied, half in jest, "I'll let you do whatever you want of me. How about that?" The young man didn't think that she would be so bold and blatant in her reply, and he was left at a loss for how to respond. Furthermore, they had come here under the guise of visiting family and friends, but in reality, the fate and fortune of his entire clan for the next few centuries, perhaps even the next millennium, hinged upon this trip. With that in mind, he definitely didn't dare to engage in a frivolous relationship with this woman while under the scrutiny of the entire town. Hence, he quickly changed the subject, pointing deeper into the alley as he smiled and said, "While it's true that we're friends, friendship and business don't mix, so I must reiterate something. According to our pre-established agreement, there are two households of interest on this clay vase alley, one of which is a master and his maidservant, while the other one is a mother and her son. I can let you choose one of the two, and in exchange, Each year, you'll be giving our old dragon city 10 pieces of cloud root stones, the specialty product of your Dawn Cloud Mountain. Do you agree to those terms, Celestial Maiden Kai? Of course, the woman replied with a nod and a seductive smile. The young man slowly strode forward as he continued, "From now on, if you obtain any items of interest in this place outside of our clan's projections, those items must be presented to our patriarchs on both sides for appraisal to determine a fair price. After that, your Dawn Cloud Mountain will offer up cloud root stones equivalent to half the value of those items. Do you have any objections to this, Kai Jinjian?" In other words, what I'm saying is that after you agree to this proposal and obtain what you came here to acquire, are you certain that you'll be able to convince the patriarchs of Dawn Cloud Mountain to agree to the terms of this bet? All of a sudden, a solemn and serious look appeared on the woman's face, and it was as if she had turned into a completely different person. The change in demeanor was extremely abrupt, and she resembled a regal empress as she said in an implacable manner, "I'm certain I can." The young man's eyes narrowed slightly as a serious look also appeared on his face, and he stopped in his tracks to look directly at Kai Jinjian. "Let me make this clear. You and I are forming a collaborative relationship here for mutual benefit, not because of anything like love at first sight or any personal reasons. Instead, it's on the basis of the mutual favor that our seniors and ancestors of Old Dragon City and Dawn Cloud Mountain have worked hard to accumulate and maintain over the course of several centuries. If we screw this up and draw the ire of those old geezers, not only will we be unable to handle the consequences, the same will apply even to our parents and our masters." Kai Jinjian smiled as she replied, "That's why during our time in this town, we have to work together with solidarity and be completely open and candid with one another, right?" Despite the dark and dingy setting of the alley that they were in, Fu Nanhua's handsome looks weren't diminished in the slightest, and he also smiled as he said, "In addition to that." He turned around to take a look behind him, then withdrew his gaze and lowered his voice as he continued, "We also have to be wary of those too. They're not from any well-established and reputable sects like Sun Scorch Mountain, and I've heard that they're extremely erratic and don't like to play by the rules." Kai Jinjian narrowed her eyes, and even though she wasn't speaking, her expressive eyes were doing the talking for her, as if they were saying, "That's why I chose you." Fu Nanhua continued in a low voice, "Let's go. There may be a sage controlling this place to balance out all forces, but it's still best to be careful so that we don't end up meeting an unexpected demise in a place like this. In any case, whether we'll be able to soar to greater heights will hinge on the success of this trip." Elsewhere, Fu Nanhua was an extremely renowned prodigy, and his heart was becoming more and more resolute as he spoke. "The Great Tao is there for my taking, and I'll eliminate anyone who dares to get in my way, even if they are immortals or gods." He cast his gaze deeper into the alley, and he spotted a thin young boy approaching them from afar. This was their second encounter. Fu Nanhua and Ken Jinjian continued onward at a leisurely pace, resembling a godly couple who were taking a vacation in the mortal realm. Kai Jinjian also spotted the young boy, and she remarked with an intrigued expression, "This is already the second time we've run into him. Could it be that he's also—" Even though her voice trailed off before she finished her sentence, Fu Nanhua knew what she wanted to say, and an amused look appeared on his face as he scoffed, "Let's be realistic here, Celestial Maiden Kai. There are over 600 households here, and if we count the servants of the 10 affluent clans as well, that amounts to a population of close to 5,000 people. No matter how remarkable this town is for producing prodigies, all of the top prodigies with exceptional aptitude have already been split up and taken by the almighty figures above us. We're only able to pick up some scraps because, for some reason or another, those almighty figures have intentionally left some for us." A self-deprecating smile also appeared on Kai Jinjian's face, and she felt rather embarrassed for her own naive optimism. After a brief hesitation, she said, "I don't know what your seniors told you, but my father told me that after entering this place, if I encounter anyone that strikes me with a sense of foreboding, I must actively avoid them, and avoid provoking them at all costs. This may only be a small town, but it's like a small puddle that appears to be innocuous from the outside, but actually holds unfathomably deep water. Those who strike us with a sense of foreboding are most likely going to be our opponents that we'll be competing with in our search for treasures in this town. As for those who evoke a sense of affinity within us, those are people who are most likely blessed with fortune and can potentially present opportunities for us to further ourselves. All we have to do is refrain from killing people as much as possible and avoid breaking those old rules that are set in stone. Aside from that, we can do whatever we please, whether that be swindling others out of their treasures or simply taking them by force. All of a sudden, her brows furrowed slightly as she continued, "By the way, why didn't you let me bring along someone from the local Zhao clan? I did study the dialect spoken in this area prior to coming here, but..." Fu Nanhua shook his head as he interjected, "All of the prominent clans here have always had some type of secret avenues through which they're connected to the outside. They're able to transmit some trivial information to the outside world right under the noses of the sages without being regarded as having broken any rules, and they've built up quite a strong foundation here over the generations. Compared with the true backers of those clans, our old Dragon City and Dawn Cloud Mountain are slightly inferior. On top of that, it's best to avoid recruiting the assistance of others as much as possible. The more people get involved in this, the more likely it is that something unexpected will happen, and that could foil our plans. If you don't want to speak, then I'll do so in your stead." Kai Jinjian smiled as she replied, "It's fine. The dialect is just a little unfamiliar to me. I'm not so pampered that I need someone else to speak for me." Fu Nanhua gave a faint smile in response, and Kai Jinjian didn't say anything further. Ultimately, they were just temporary allies, so they weren't all that close with one another. Besides, in the eyes of ambitious individuals pursuing the Great Tao, even close familial bonds were nothing more than trivial relationships. Fu Nanhua was speaking in a refined and regal manner, as if he were the young master of an extremely well-off clan. There was actually a very simple reason behind why he was willing to disclose a closely guarded secret and reveal the cultivation method taught to him in private by his father to Kai Jinjian. In contrast with the other two people that they had previously been traveling with, namely a slow and prudent middle-aged man and the cold and forbidding young woman in black, Fu Nanhua had decided that he was going to kill Kai Jinjian from the moment he set foot into the town. Fu Nanhua unconsciously gripped onto the green jade pendant hanging from his waist, something that he always kept by his side. Kai Jinjian closed her eyes in contemplation, then reopened them a moment later as she decided, "I'll choose Gukan." "All right, then it's settled," Fu Nanhua replied as he raised an eyebrow. Meanwhile, Chen Ping'an had made his way to the entrance of his courtyard, and he was just about to step inside when Fu Nanhua and Kai Jinjian hurriedly approached him. The former smiled as he said, "We meet again. What a coincidence." Chen Ping'an turned around upon hearing the voice behind him, and he nodded in response as he asked, "Can I help you with something?" Fu Nanhua was very fluent in the dialect used in the small town, and he said, "This place is called Clay Vase Alley, right? I wanted to ask you if there's someone by the name of Song Jisun living here, and also a child by the name of Gu Kan. I'm from the capital, and my parents are family friends of Song Jisun's father. This here is Kai Jinjian, and she's a relative of Gu Kan's mother, which is why we were traveling together. What a coincidence it is that both of the people that we're looking for are living in the same alley. Everything's so conveniently put together that it almost feels like the storyline of a novel." Fu Nanhua wore a calm and friendly smile on his face as he spoke, and even though he was speaking to a lowly young boy like Chen Ping'an, he still went out of his way to bend over slightly so that his face was level with Chen Ping'an's, rather than towering over and looking down on him. It was a very natural and thoughtful gesture that didn't arouse any suspicions that he could be up to no good, and it presented him as a kind and modest gentleman. A bashful smile appeared on Chen Ping'an's face as he replied, "It really is quite the coincidence." Fu Nanhua's smile widened even further as he asked in a gentle voice, "May I ask where those two are living on this alley?" To his surprise, Chen Ping'an shook his head as he replied, "I was an apprentice at a dragon kiln until just recently, so I was living outside the town for many years and only just moved back. Hence, I'm not very familiar with my neighbors on this alley. Perhaps you should ask someone else." Fu Nanhua's smile remained unchanged, and he didn't immediately offer a response, seemingly pausing to consider how best to proceed. Kai Jinjian smiled as she interjected, "Lying is not a good habit, little boy. Do you think we look like bad people?" Setting that aside, what mischief could we possibly be up to under broad daylight? Qin Pingyan blinked innocently as he replied, "But I really don't know." Kai Jinjian reverted back to her normal dialect as she turned to Fu Nanhua and asked, "Could it be that this boy wants to be compensated?" "It doesn't look like it," Fu Nanhua replied. A hint of extremely well-concealed agitation flashed through Kai Jinjian's eyes as she said, "If worst comes to worst, we'll just have to knock on the door of every household here. We'll be able to find the people we're looking for eventually." Fu Nanhua waved a hand at her to dismiss this idea, then patiently turned back to Qin Pingyan as he offered, "How about this? If you help us out, I'll give you something." Qin Pingyan scratched his head as he looked back at Fu Nanhua with a pair of clear and innocent eyes. All of a sudden, Fu Nanhua abruptly stood up straight again. He had spotted a scholarly young boy squatting on top of a wall not far away from them, and the boy was observing them while perched on his vantage point. Beside the young boy stood a girl of around the same age. Only the top half of her face was visible, but it could be seen that she had a very clean and elegant appearance, with a pair of delicate eyebrows. In that instant, Fu Nanhua was convinced that this young boy was the person that he was looking for. The boy stood up as he asked in a loud voice, "Are you looking for someone?" Fu Nanhua and Kai Jinjian were forced to raise their heads to look up at him, and the former replied, "That's right, I'm looking for you, and my companion here is looking for Gu Kan. Can you help us?" "Do you know me?" the boy asked with furrowed brows. Fu Nanhua smiled as he replied, "Of course not, but I'm familiar with Master Song, who's currently working in the Ministry of Rites." Song Jisun didn't waste any more time with small talk as he asked, "I can help you find that snotty brat, Gu Kan, but what's in it for me?" Fu Nanhua immediately removed the green jade pendant hanging from his waist, then tossed it at Song Jisun. "You can have this." Song Jisun was rather taken aback as he caught the jade pendant, but his expression remained unchanged as he turned to Jigui and instructed, "Go take them to Gu Kan." Jigui nodded in response and emerged from the courtyard. Standing on the narrow street outside, it was as if her very presence alone was enough to illuminate the entirety of Clay Vase Alley. Fu Nanhua turned to Qin Pingyan as he smiled and said, "I'll leave you with a parting message, little boy. Even the rain that falls from the heavens can't nurture a plant without a root." He then made his way over to Jigui, but Kai Jinjian remained standing in front of Qin Pingyan, looking down at him with an amused expression as she asked, "Do you know what that means?" For some reason, she was suddenly struck by the urge to tease the young boy, and before Qin Pingyan had a chance to reply, she chuckled, "He was telling you that you just missed out on a huge opportunity. If he were willing to spare even a bit of the dirt scraped out from under his fingernails and give it to you, you would be able to live in comfort and excess for the rest of your life here. Fortunately for you, you're probably never going to find out exactly what it is that you missed out on today. I suppose that's the only silver lining on the cloud. Otherwise, you'd be kicking yourself with remorse." Fu Nanhua could hear what she was saying, and he felt like her words were completely wasted on the young boy who clearly had no idea what she was talking about. Compared with the people in the town, those on the outside resided in a completely different world, and the gulf between them was wider than the distance between heaven and earth. Kai Jinjian continued to look at Qin Pingyan as she strode backward, re-emphasizing as she approached Jigui, "Even the rain that falls from the heavens can't nurture a plant without a root. Make sure you don't forget that saying." Qin Pingyan's expression remained unchanged this entire time, but he suddenly exclaimed, "Look out behind you." Kai Jinjian's entire body abruptly stiffened. "There's dog shit," Qin Pingyan finished. As aforementioned, Kai Jinjian was walking backward, and in the instant that she stepped on the pile of dog shit, she could already feel that there was something strange underfoot. What was more embarrassing than stepping in dog shit was to be seen by others while doing so, and what was even more humiliating than that was being told by an observer that you really had trodden on dog shit. Kai Jinjian wasn't someone who was easily riled up, and she certainly wasn't a pampered little girl who couldn't withstand any adversity. The fact that she was able to stand out and be selected out of all of the many descendants of the master of Dawn Cloud Mountain was a clear testament to her character. Dawn Cloud Mountain encompassed a total of 18 peaks of different sizes, all of which were enveloped in clouds and mist all year round. The cloud root stone produced on the mountain was an important material in alchemy for those following the alchemy branch of Taoism. It was renowned for its pristine purity, and it was unrivaled in that regard. Hence, ensuring cleanliness was an important priority for the people on Dawn Cloud Mountain, and most of them had mysophobia, including Kai Jinjian. If it weren't for how important this town was, she would have never set foot in this place, let alone stepped onto Clay Vase Alley, which was laden with mud and fecal matter from all types of different animals. What was most frustrating to her was that they were supposed to be high and mighty immortals, yet upon arriving in this town, they were like helpless fish that had been tossed onto the shore, losing everything that they had previously taken for granted in the blink of an eye. Their almighty clans that resided in blessed paradise, their mystical powers that allowed them to move mountains and rivers, their powerful treasures that were capable of taming demons and slaying gods, all of that had been instantly taken away from them. And now, she had trodden on dog shit. Fu Nanhua was rather amused by this turn of events. Who could have ever imagined that the pristine and pure celestial maiden Kai of Dawn Cloud Mountain would ever have a pile of sticky and stinky dog shit clinging to her boot? However, in the next instant, the amusement on his face immediately faded, and he yelled, "Stop." Standing on the earthen wall, Song Jison's pupils abruptly contracted, and he reflexively tightened his grip around the jade pendant in his hand. As it turned out, Kai Jinjian had lunged over to Qin Ping'an in what seemed like just a single stride, and her fair and slender hand was hurtling rapidly toward the top of Qin Ping'an's head. In the instant that Fu Nanhua yelled out to stop her, her hand drew to an abrupt halt, and after a brief pause, she gently raised it before patting Qin Ping'an's head in what appeared to be an affectionate, doting gesture. She bent over slightly to look straight into Qin Ping'an's eyes, which resembled puddles of water so clear that one could see straight to the bottom. Kai Jinjian could almost see her own reflection in those eyes, but she was in no mood to be appreciating such trivial things. A fake smile appeared on her face as she said, "I know what you did there. You intentionally delayed your warning, didn't you?" Fu Nanhua heaved a faint sigh of relief upon seeing this. If Kai Jinjian had killed someone in broad daylight here, there was a very good chance that they would have been evicted from the town, and the entire Dawn Cloud Mountain would have been made into a massive laughingstock over her actions. A stern look appeared on his face as he said in an authentic official dialect, "Please think before you act, Kai Jinjian. If you continue to be so reckless, I will be inclined to terminate our collaboration. I don't want to have my plans foiled by your reckless actions." Kai Jinjian had her back facing Fu Nanhua, and she rapidly chanted a calming mantra to distract herself from her anger. She then quickly turned around and flashed Fu Nanhua an apologetic smile as she said, "My apologies for losing my cool. I promise you that nothing like this will happen again during our time here." "Are you sure?" Fu Nanhua asked with a cold smile. Kai Jinjian merely smiled and offered no response to Fu Nanhua. Instead, she turned to face Qin Ping'an again, then murmured to herself in her official dialect, "Our Dawn Cloud Mountain derives its roots from one of the 5 branches of Buddhism. And one of the most important things that we're taught is to rein in worldly desires and avoid worldly distractions. Prior to coming here, I had no idea what such things even were, and my seniors didn't want to offer the answer up to me on a silver platter, so they told me to figure it out for myself. Never would I have imagined that I would develop an idea of what those concepts are after stepping on a pile of dog excrement on your clay vase alley. It's already been quite some time since you stepped on the dog shit. Why have you still not scraped it off yet?" Qin Ping'an asked with a perplexed expression. Kai Jinjian had just found some semblance of inner peace through the chanting of her mantra, but after hearing what Qin Ping'an had to say, she instantly found herself once again unable to suppress her worldly emotions. A furious look appeared on her face, but Fu Nanhua's warning was still fresh in her mind. so she could only prod Chen Ping'an's forehead firmly with her finger to vent her fury, glowering angrily at him as she said, "Have you not been taught those who are insolent will meet an early demise, and those who are vitriolic will lose all their good fortune?" Chen Ping'an was unfazed by Cai Jinjian's firm prod to the forehead, and he turned to look at Song Jisun in silence. Song Jisun immediately flared with rage upon seeing this. "Why are you looking at me, Chen Ping'an? Are you trying to imply something?" Only now did Fu Nanhua discover that he still hadn't set foot in Song Jisun's yard yet, and a displeased look appeared on his face as he turned to Cai Jinjian with undisguised vexation in his eyes. To think that there would be someone in this world who would be delayed in their pursuit of the great Tao all because they had trodden on some dog shit. Never have I seen anyone so foolish. In a remarkable display of restraint, Cai Jinjian remained calm and collected despite Fu Nanhua's insult, and she took one final glance at Chen Ping'an before turning to depart. All of a sudden, Chen Ping'an remarked, "You have very long eyelashes, big sister. How dare a lowly ant like him take liberties with me?" Cai Jinjian was furious, and she immediately turned around, deciding there and then that she was going to teach this filthy mutt a lesson. In her eyes, Chen Ping'an appeared to be honest and innocent on the outside, but in reality, he was as sly and cunning as a fox. Even though she was extremely restricted upon entering this place, temporarily unable to use any of her treasures and abilities, she had reaped the benefits of cultivating from a young age. Her physical constitution was constantly being enhanced through her cultivation, and the effects weren't very pronounced, far less so than the fruits one could expect to reap from specializing in martial arts training. But she was still more than sufficiently equipped to deal with a young boy who had grown up his entire life in this rural town. All she had to do was target some of the important acupoints on his body to strike him down with a series of ailments that would lead to an early demise, and it would have been an incredibly simple task. But as she peered into the dim alley, all she saw was a tanned face and a pair of bright eyes looking back at her. Cai Jinjian's eyes immediately lit up upon seeing this, following which the sympathy innately present in women welled up in her heart. The sympathy in her eyes then gradually faded as a bright smile appeared on her face, and she was struck by a sense of enlightenment. This was a perfect opportunity for her to overcome an internal demon. Ever since Dawn Cloud Mountain was founded by Patriarch Dawn Cloud, an idea had always been championed, which was that the beginning and end of every fated meeting was a tribulation-transcending experience. Of course, there was no set method for transcending these tribulations, and it was required for the transcender to work out solutions on their own. Cai Jinjian was currently in one of these exact situations. She felt like she had identified the worldly distraction that she had to suppress, and it was none other than the young boy before her. Thus, she raised her palm once again before placing it over Chen Ping'an's chest, then gently pressed down on it. That sequence of movements was performed extremely quickly and smoothly, and even though Chen Ping'an had reacted by taking a half step backward, he was still unable to avoid Cai Jinjian's palm. Fu Nanhua was staring intently at Cai Jinjian's seductive figure, but not only did he not feel even the slightest hint of attraction or entrancement, his heart was filled with murderous rage. He forcibly suppressed his killing intent as he yelled in a furious voice. That tap on the forehead alone was enough to constantly rack him with ailments for the rest of his life. Surely such a punishment was already sufficient. Why did you go even further? Have you lost your mind, Cai Jinjian? Are you really going to abandon your pursuit of the great Tao just to exact vengeance on a filthy stray mutt? Cai Jinjian paid no heed to his accusations, and Fu Nanhua lowered his voice as he recovered his composure and sneered. To think that the vastly renowned Cai Jinjian of Dawn Cloud Mountain would be so petty that she would willingly stoop to the same level as an uneducated youth. Are you not embarrassed by your actions? Cai Jinjian turned to him with a smile as she replied, "This alley is truly a blessed place for me. I didn't think that I would stumble upon a fated opportunity, even during such a chance encounter. It's nowhere near enough to make a significant difference, but it's certainly a great omen. I have even more confidence in that boy by the name of Gukan now." Fu Nanhua was rather taken aback to hear this. Did she really just attain some type of enlightenment just now? Cai Jinjian raised her foot to inspect the disgusting fecal matter clinging to her boot, and she chuckled. Come to think of it, This was the thing that bestowed this fated opportunity upon me. Song Jisun wore an uncertain expression, and it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. Meanwhile, Ji Gue remained standing on the spot in silence, but all of a sudden, a pair of golden pupils appeared in each of her eyes, only to vanish just as abruptly as they had appeared. Fu Nanhua seemed to have vaguely detected this, and he immediately turned around to inspect his surroundings, but was unable to find anything worthy of note. In the end, he briefly scrutinized Ji Gue, but didn't discover anything amiss either. Thus, he could only chalk that inexplicable sense of discomfort that he had just felt down to Kai Jinjian's reckless actions, which had to have drawn the scrutiny of the sage in the town. Kai Jinjian was in a much better mood than before, and as a result, she was able to comb through many of the trains of thought that had previously stagnated in her mind. This was not just some insignificant opportunity. There were a couple of reasons for her trip to this small town, the first of which was that Dawn Cloud Mountain required a sufficiently powerful immortal treasure to hold in the fortune of the sect, which had been constantly seeping out of late. Furthermore, she also needed to succeed on this trip in order to solidify her status as the heir to the position of Mountain Master. Otherwise, she would have immediately left this godforsaken place and returned to Dawn Cloud Mountain to go into seclusion for a decade or two. Kai Jinjian began to make her way toward Ji Gue, but right at this moment, Qin Ping'an suddenly asked, "Did you do something to me just now?" "You're being too paranoid, kid," Kai Jinjian replied without even turning her head. Qin Ping'an fell silent upon hearing this, but Kai Jinjian suddenly turned to him with a smile as she declared, "You only have half a year left to live at most." Qin Ping'an was dumbfounded by this sudden revelation, and Kai Jinjian was very amused to see this. "I was just kidding. I didn't think you would actually believe me." Qin Ping'an smiled in response. In that instant, a hint of disdain welled up in the hearts of both Fu Nanhua and Kai Jinjian. In their eyes, Qin Ping'an was nothing more than an ignorant and powerless ant. Song Jisun was watching the unfolding scene while squatting on top of the wall, and he was massaging his own temples with a serious look on his face, an expression that was quite rare for him. Even though Kai Jinjian had already gone to find Gukun with Ji Gue, and Qin Ping'an had also returned to his own courtyard, the observant Song Jisun remained squatting on the wall in a daze. He could see that there was a thin young boy standing on Clay Vase Alley, and he looked on at Kai Jinjian's parting figure for a while before quickly withdrawing his gaze. He then made his way to the gate of his own courtyard, but the gate refused to open even as he pushed on it insistently. Song Jisun really detested this feeling. In his eyes, Qin Ping'an was completely unremarkable in every way, but sometimes he was like a rock in a latrine. If it weren't moved, then it would get in the way, but moving it required one to get their hands dirty. Song Jisun was so caught up in his own thoughts that he failed to hear what Fu Nanhua was saying behind him, and thus, Fu Nanhua was forced to repeat himself. "Song Jisun, did you know that there's a type of people in this world that are completely different from the likes of you and that boy?" Song Jisun finally returned to his senses, and he remained squatting on top of the wall as he turned around to look down at Fu Nanhua, replying in an indifferent voice, "I do." Fu Nanhua was expecting a negative response from Song Jisun, upon which he would offer an explanation, so this was quite an unexpected reply. However, he wasn't convinced that Song Jisun was telling the truth, and he smiled as he asked, "Do you really?" A cold look appeared in Song Jisun's eyes as he sneered. "You want to tell me that there are people who can bring the dead back to life, who can live for all of eternity and possess limitless power, right?" Fu Nanhua nodded in response with a pleased expression. "It looks like, in some sense, you and I can be considered to be fellow Taoists." Song Jisun took a glance at the gate of the neighboring courtyard out of the corner of his eyes, seemingly rather distracted. Fu Nanhua declared in a candid manner, "Seeing as you're already knowledgeable about such matters, I won't waste any more of our time. Regardless of what you have, as long as you're willing to sell it, just state a price, and I'll buy it even if I have to sell everything that I own." Song Jisun was rather perplexed. "I can tell that you possess a loftier status in your clan than that woman does in hers, so why is it that she was treating that boy with such disdain just now, yet you're willing to treat you as an equal?" Fu Nanhua asked, concluding Song Jisun's sentence for him. Song Jisun nodded in response as he praised, "You're a pretty smart guy." It's always easier talking with smart people. Even though Song Jisun was physically looking down at him and speaking to him in a rather condescending fashion, Fu Nanhua remained completely unbothered. In stark contrast with Kai Jinjian, who had regarded Chen Ping'an as nothing more than a mere ant, not only did Fu Nanhua feel a sense of intimacy toward Song Jisun, he also felt an inexplicable sense of awe and veneration toward Clay Vase Alley as a whole. Hence, Fu Nanhua was truly regarding Song Jisun as his equal. On the path to pursuing the Great Tao, the further one advanced, the less significance there was in things like status, gender, age, and other factors. Song Jisun jumped down from the wall, then said in a low voice, "Let's talk inside." Fu Nanhua nodded in response. "After you." While stepping over the doorstep, Song Jisun asked in a casual manner, "By the way, what's your relationship with that woman from earlier?" "We're temporarily working together, but we're not walking the same path," Fu Nanhua immediately replied without any hesitation. Song Jisun nodded in response, then said some rather inexplicable things. "In that case, aren't you beating around the bush too much? I heard that the outside world is filled with demons, gods, immortals, and all manners of bizarre and spectacular things. But all those who pursue the path of cultivation are supposed to settle all differences right away in order to avoid trouble that could arise further down the line. Is that not the case?" As the eldest young master of an immortal clan from Old Dragon City, Fu Nanhua was shrewd beyond his years, and he immediately understood what Song Jisun wanted, despite the cryptic content of his words. Hence, he smiled as he asked, "Is there some bad blood between you two?" Song Jisun's eyes widened as he put on a surprised facade. "What are you talking about?" He then seemed to have realized that his act wasn't fooling Fu Nanhua at all, so he abandoned his exaggerated display of feigned surprise, and he sat down onto a chair in the room before extending a hand, inviting Fu Nanhua to also take a seat. After that, a serious look appeared on his face as he said, "The name of the boy from the neighboring house is Chen Ping'an, and he lost his parents at a very young age. Even though we've been neighbors for many years, we haven't had even a single argument. You may not believe me, but that's up to you." Fu Nanhua was instantly able to read between the lines and understand what Song Jisun was insinuating. He was informing Fu Nanhua that Chen Ping'an was just an orphan with no one to rely on and no ties to this world, so even if he were to die, no one would look into his death. After arriving at that realization, Fu Nanhua was left feeling a little bemused. It had suddenly occurred to him that fate really did work in some rather absurd ways at times. It could be said that by intentionally withholding the address of Song Jisun and Ji Gue from Fu Nanhua, Chen Ping'an had inadvertently brought disaster upon himself, and this was ultimately going to lead to his demise. Given Song Jisun's privileged background, someone like Chen Ping'an should have been far beneath him, yet here, he was essentially asking Fu Nanhua to have Chen Ping'an killed. With that in mind, Fu Nanhua couldn't help but be reminded of a saying, "Even as infants, the offspring of tigers and leopards already possess the will to hunt cows." Meanwhile, Gukun had already been locked in his house, while his mother and the self-proclaimed true lord were sitting across from one another. The old man was scrutinizing his own palm, which was riddled with lines, and shortly thereafter, he folded his palm away with a faint smile as he declared, "It is done." A puzzled look appeared on the woman's face as she asked, "May I ask what you did to make Chen Ping'an?" All of a sudden, a cold gleam flashed through the old man's eyes, and the woman was so frightened to see this that she immediately stopped talking. The old man cast his gaze toward the gate of the courtyard, then gently swept a sleeve through the air, conjuring up a light breeze that swirled around the courtyard incessantly. He then explained, "I have only come here as I'm in a very troublesome predicament and had no choice but to journey to this place. I'm not in any direct danger for now, but the longer I stay here, the more." Just as that boy, Song Jisun, said, "Too much beating around the bush will only lead to a calamitous outcome. The good thing is that that man has invoked both the resentment of the heavens and the rage of the people. Even though he has already made a huge concession, his ultimate demise will still be inevitable. What a pity." He could have ascended to extremely lofty heights, but instead, everything took a drastic turn for the worse for him, and his current situation is one that is truly tragic to behold. Only by taking advantage of this opportunity was I able to make some plans for your son. Now, I must see if I can put an end to that boy's life while also avoiding future repercussions by ensuring that no sages or immortals will figure out what's been done here. Only then can I ensure that this new disciple of mine will be able to ascend like the wind on his cultivation journey and ultimately rise to become a dragon." The woman was sweating profusely as she listened in silence. The old man smiled as he mused, "You must think it strange that someone like me, who has dedicated himself to cultivation and the pursuit of the great Tao, would end up being so petty and hostile. In fact, I dare say you're thinking that I'm no better than an uneducated village woman like yourself, isn't that right?" The woman hurriedly lowered her head as she replied in a trembling voice, "I wouldn't dare to think such insolent things." The old man merely smiled and didn't say anything further, waiting in silence for Kai Jinjian's arrival. On the path of cultivation, there was no limit to the power that one could obtain. Kai Jinjian regarded the residents of the town as ants, but in the eyes of a true lord, she and Fu Nanhua were nothing more than mere ants themselves, and there was no need for him to reason with an ant that he could easily stomp into the dirt.